The big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one.
Let's respectfully disagree, that's what we like,
Absolutely.
on Jubes and Kerr.
Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
It's 12 noon. A very good afternoon to you. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this Thursday, Matt Hancock denouncing what he said was a massive betrayal and breach of trust after the latest leaking of his lockdown WhatsApp messages. Well, the latest allegation this morning, he tried to bypass Education Secretary Sir Gavin Williamson to have schools closed back in December 2020. We'll have the latest reaction, with more revelations, of course, expected in the coming days. And where does this leave the official public inquiry into COVID? Families to find out today if MI5 could have stopped the Manchester Arena bombing. We're expecting to find out more about what the security services knew about Salman Abedi and if they had the opportunity to stop him before his bomb attack. We're live in Manchester as those conclusions are released. Is it another Royal Rumble kicking off? The Duke and Duchess of Sussex asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage in Windsor. Will it now be musical chairs or cottages for the royal family, with suggestions Prince Andrew will also be moved from the palatial Royal Lodge? Latest with our royal reporter. And get in touch, of course, with all your take on today's top stories. gbviews at gbnews.uk. Before that, latest headlines coming up with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 12. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Matt Hancock says he's a victim of a massive betrayal after more than 100,000 of his WhatsApp messages were leaked. The former Health Secretary handed over his texts to journalist Isabel Oakeshott as they collaborated on his memoirs. She then passed them on to The Telegraph. The paper claims Mr Hancock clashed with then Education Secretary Sir Gavin Williamson over schools during the COVID pandemic. Hancock reportedly said he was mounting rearguard action to close schools in December 2020. That's despite Sir Gavin fighting tooth and nail to keep them open. Minister for Schools Nick Gibb told GB News the pandemic meant making rapid and difficult decisions.
Those WhatsApp messages were messages where people were saying things in the heat of the argument. But I know Gavin Williamson very well. He respects teachers very highly. And of course, there are big decisions that were being made, very rapidly during that period about whether to keep schools open and so on. But ultimately, we rely on the medical evidence coming from the Chief Medical Officer and from the Department of Health in making those very important decisions.
The search for a missing baby in Brighton has ended after the remains of an infant were found in Woodland last night. Police say the body was found close to where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon were arrested on Monday. The couple had evaded authorities for more than 7 weeks and had refused to give any information on the location or welfare of their baby. They're currently being held on suspicion of child neglect manslaughter. The Home Secretary has reportedly blamed political correctness for creating what she calls a blind spot for Islamist extremists to operate under the radar. According to The Times, Suella Braverman was speaking at a counter-extremism conference where she said the entire concept of political correctness should be banished. Her comments come just hours before the release of a final report into the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, in which 22 people were killed. The report's expected to reveal details of the radicalisation of Manchester-born terrorist Salman Abedi. Teachers in Wales and the south of England are on strike today in a long-running dispute over pay. It's the third walkout by members of the National Education Union this week, with previous industrial action taking place in the north of England and the Midlands. The Education Secretary had invited teaching unions to take part in talks on the condition the strikes were suspended. But the unions demanded a better pay offer first. Further national strikes in England and Wales are planned for March the 15th and 16th. The number of children and young people receiving urgent treatment for eating disorders in England has risen by 66% since 2019. The Royal College of Psychiatrists says services have been flooded with referrals. It's warning there's a postcode lottery of care and is calling for more staff to help ease the backlog. UK renewables have generated more electricity than gas this winter, that's according to new analysis. The Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit says enough was created to power every UK home through the winter. Renewable energy, including wind and nuclear, accounted for 38% of all electricity produced in the UK last year. Despite a reduction in the use of gas amid rising wholesale prices, it still accounted for 40% of generated power. Abusive attacks on retail staff have almost doubled since before the pandemic. A survey by the British Retail Consortium found that over 850 incidents were recorded every day between 2021 and 2022. This includes racial and sexual abuse, physical assault and threatening with a weapon. Industry leaders are calling on the police and the courts to make tackling retail crime a priority. And high street retailer WH Smith says it's been the target of a cyber attack for the second time in a year. The firm says company and employee data have been accessed by the hackers. But it says trading activities haven't been impacted, nor have its website, customer accounts or customer databases, which are all on separate systems. And to mark World Book Day, the Queen Consort has spoken about the importance of reading from an early age. In conversation with Children's Laureate Joseph Coelho, Camilla said reading helps youngsters understand different places, cultures and ways of life. She also said reading to her grandchildren has been a wonderful bonding experience. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to Mark.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed. Let's just update you very quickly. First on the latest on the so-called lockdown files. We'll head back to Westminster in a moment. Downing Street just saying it does not agree with any suggestion that teachers were trying to find an excuse not to work during the COVID-19 pandemic. This just coming from the Prime Minister's spokesman, follow those leaked messages between Matt Hancock and the then Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, published by the Daily Telegraph. We'll have more on that in a moment with Tom Harwood, our political correspondent. But let's just take you to Scotland, because First Minister's questions are underway in Holyrood. There is Nicola Sturgeon, and of course it follows the first leadership hustings last night in Cumbernauld to find her replacement. Now, the party's been accused of secrecy because it was not allowing media access to these hustings. But we know that Kate Forbes, Ash Regan and Humza Yousaf were facing questions from party members at that first leadership meeting. They had no common ground, it seems, for dealing with the government's block on legislation, Section 35, but all saying independence was a priority. But let's actually reflect, too, on their comments on Europe, because interesting comments from Humza Yousaf that Scotland should demand, as he said, access to the EU single market, following, of course, what we heard from Rishi Sunak following the Northern Ireland Windsor framework. And then Ash Regan, in addition, saying Scotland should join the European Free Trade Association. So you're very much featuring in their discussions, but we'll have more reaction coming up with our Scotland reporter. But let's actually now reflect on the lockdown files, with former Health Secretary Matt Hancock saying that these messages being leaked to the Daily Telegraph newspaper by journalist Isabel Oakeshott were a betrayal and a breach of trust. Well, the newspaper's been handed more than 100,000 WhatsApp messages from the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, Mr Hancock serving at that time as Health Secretary. Well, Oakeshott's defended her move by arguing it's in the overwhelming public interest to see them in the open, earlier saying that she had feared the upcoming COVID inquiry would be a whitewash. That's actually been denied by the inquiry itself. Well, more revelations expected in the Telegraph in the coming days. Joining us now, our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, with the latest from Westminster. Tom, is this growing into a spat between Isabel Oakeshott and Matt Hancock, or because we've had this Downing Street reaction in the past few minutes, seeing real matters of public substance?
Well, I think there's always been this spat since the first revelations of these leaked messages were made 2 nights ago. That I think was the point at which the relationship between Matt Hancock and Isabel Oakeshott clearly broke down. Messages were sent, accusations were made. But yes, the real sort of substantive point of this is how does the government respond, and frankly, how does the government prepare for what might be to come? It's interesting how the most salient political points of what is going on here aren't potentially the most substantive policy points. It's more how the Education Secretary described unions and, by extension, some may claim teachers as not wanting to work. That seems to be the bigger political hit that the government has taken today, rather than the discussions over what should or should not have been locked down. Should schools have closed when they did? Was there a way to keep them open? I think those are live discussions which we can now see in these messages that were going on at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. I think the public may well find some sympathy with the government having these active debates, wondering what is best for the health of the nation and what is best for the education of the nation's children.
Yeah, but an interesting insight as to the thinking, a pretty pejorative term being used in terms of the teachers, the teaching unions, which is why perhaps Downing Street has had to come out with this public statement that there's no suggestion the teachers are trying to find an excuse not to work. And one question is, where does this now leave the official public inquiry? The chairman having to come out to deny that there'll be any whitewash and indicating that, they're trying to press on with it as quickly as possible.
Yes, I think this means our eyes will be more keenly tuned to the COVID inquiry, which has already got underway. Evidence sessions have begun. And, of course, the material that we're now seeing drip-fed onto the front pages of the Daily Telegraph day by day is information that the COVID inquiry is privy to. All of these messages were handed to the COVID inquiry some time ago. But more importantly than that, the COVID inquiry also has other supplementary information, whether it's email backlogs or indeed minutes from meetings, and it will be obtaining oral evidence as well. So the argument from Matt Hancock here will really be the proper place to assess what was actually going on, rather than just looking at one channel of communication, incomplete as it is, will be the COVID inquiry, with powers to look at all of the communication in the round to understand what happened and when. But yes, there is now a great deal more political pressure for this inquiry to perhaps be more open, be more public, and potentially be more expedited.
Yeah, and of course the reality being that the Telegraph, perhaps for a few days to come, will be revealing more in what they call the lockdown files. But Tom in Westminster for the moment, thank you indeed for that. But let's stay with the politics. Boris Johnson, we've not heard from him in terms of that Windsor framework, in terms of the Northern Ireland Agreement, but he is here looking to the horizon at the Brand Finance Global Soft Power Summit. Yes, that is the official summit, but the importance being they are addressing the issue, of course, of foreign policy and Ukraine in particular, because other speakers include First Lady of Ukraine, Olena Zelenska, and indications, of course, that the question of whether we supply more armaments, particularly these fast jets to Ukraine, that Boris Johnson has indicated that should be a question. But I think he is trying to find his notes. Maybe the Peppa Pig page has dropped out. Who knows? Anyway, we shall reflect on what he's got to say a little later. But let's return now to the issue of the lockdown files, as the Telegraph is calling them, and get the views of veteran political commentator Peter Spencer, who joins us. And Peter, a veteran in the best sense that you've seen these incidents before. We remember the MP's expenses files, of course, that the Telegraph was actually carrying. And huge import, it seems, as Isabel Oakeshott said, on matters of public importance.
Absolutely. I mean, overall, what I'm reading from all this is that British government ministers, like government ministers right across the world, faced with an unprecedented and utterly scary, pernicious, death-dealing pandemic, were like so many rabbits caught in the headlights. Of course they made mistakes. They got some bits right, they got some bits horribly wrong, and that's what the inquiry is all about, obviously. But overall, when it comes to potential damage to members of the government, I don't think any of this is really going to matter unless in some way some mud can be made to stick at Rishi Sunak himself, now Prime Minister. It's worth remembering that at the time he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he bit the bullet of and actually sort of went against his own political instincts and launched the furlough scheme. Imperfect though it was, it saved the country from a great deal of destitution. So in the round, he had a very good pandemic, and for that reason, I don't see any huge damage being done to the government.
Yeah, because, of course, Matt Hancock, technically a former health secretary. But, looking at the front page of the Telegraph and what they're making of this, it does, of course, have echoes of what they did about MPs' expenses. So they're likely to keep running with it. As a journalist, what do you make of what Isabel Oakeshott is claiming, that this is still in the public interest? Or is it just a good story and now developing into a spat between her and Matt Hancock?
I'm rather inclined to the latter. There are base instincts within our profession. And there she was collaborating with Matt Hancock on the writing, effectively ghostwriting his memoirs. And then she thought, hello, hang on a minute. There's a few, dare I say this, a few bob in this. I can't resist getting it out there. I mean, okay, she says she's worried that the official inquiry is going to be a whitewash. Well, I have to say I don't really buy that. I think there's a little bit of opportunism going on there, and most certainly the Telegraph, the Telegraph are having a lovely time. It seems only yesterday with those expenses things when night after night I'd have to stand up on the telly and start talking about people I'd never jolly well heard of, and with about 5 minutes to spare, it was it's what at that time they had a whole special part of the building dedicated to that particular story, and I'm sure they have again.
However, just touching on what you have mentioned, I mean, it is important, I guess, that the public finds out what was going on behind the scenes, bearing in mind, I mean, I think the figures, obviously, in terms of those in the care homes in the period between the full lockdown being applied was 17,678 deaths. So there is a public interest to that extent. But as you said, I mean, are we just learning that, governments panic like the rest of us in terms of trying to work out what to do?
Well, of course they are, and so much of it. I mean, we consider how much money, for example, was spent ill-advisedly on special protective equipment, and also, how long the lockdown should have gone on, when they should have started, when they should have finished, and indeed, there's also the question about the government buying equipment. To counter the whole COVID threat, and the suggestion that they did a few pretty nifty shortcuts there. Well, they needed equipment, not like, after due process in 6 months' time. They needed it like today. And so they were bound to make mistakes, some of them hideous, some of them cost lives.
Peter, as ever, thank you for your intake or assessment, of course, and we'll see what the lockdown files continue with in the days to come. For the moment, thanks very much indeed. And, of course, more from Westminster too, as we were saying, the Prime Minister's spokesman reflecting on the whole issue about teachers' unions. There may well be more reaction as the afternoon continues. We'll have that for you, as we will indeed in terms of the post-mortem being carried out into the baby's remains discovered in Brighton in that inquiry. That's ongoing. And we'll be reflecting on the third and final volume of the Manchester Arena inquiry. That's to be published this afternoon from St John Saunders. We'll have the very latest oil reaction coming up. Stay with us here on GB News Live.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Most places having a dry day today, but there are a few showers across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Southern areas enjoying the sunniest skies. Still feeling pretty chilly where it stays grey. High pressure is dominating. Around the area of high pressure, the winds go clockwise, so feeding in quite a lot of cloud and a few showers from the North Sea into parts of eastern Scotland and a few for the east of Northern Ireland as well. So showers continuing in southern Scotland, but generally elsewhere it's dry. Quite a lot of cloud for Scotland, Northern England and eastern England, but some spells of sunshine for southern England and South Wales. Out of the breeze here. Feeling pretty pleasant with temperatures perhaps up to 11 Celsius. Where it stays drab, 7 or 8. Will feel pretty chilly. Should see some good spells of sunshine again across westernmost parts of Scotland. Clear skies here will allow frost overnight. Temperatures dropping quickly under the clear skies in the southwest, but cloud generally spilling back in. A few showers may keep going over northern England and the east of Northern Ireland, but most will have a dry night. You can see that frost there across western Scotland. Further south, some pockets of frost if skies stay clear, but most towns and cities start Friday at 2 or 3 Celsius and a cold feeling cloudy day again for many, but we should see plenty of sunshine across Scotland, brightening up across southern Scotland, Northern Ireland as we go through the day. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud, a cloudier day in the south compared to today, but still temperatures might just about get at double figures. Generally, these values are touched below average for this time of year. I'm feeling colder with a brisk breeze along some of these eastern coasts. Not a great deal of change during Friday night, or indeed as we go through the weekend. We are looking at some showery rain coming into the far north, and that is signs of colder air then pushing in through the weekend. So it is going to turn colder and colder still next week, with the possibility of some snow in places.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, post-mortem is continuing on the remains of a baby discovered by police in Brighton after the search for the missing child of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon. A forensic search still being carried out too in the Hollingdean area of Brighton, with a couple facing further questioning. A magistrate granted police permission to hold them for a further 36 hours on suspicion of child neglect and manslaughter by gross negligence. Well, our national reporter Ellie Costello can join us now from Brighton. And Ellie, still plenty of activity down there today.
There certainly is, Mark, and this is clearly not the outcome that anybody wanted. It seems to have really shocked the local community, as it would. People have been laying flowers here all morning, and we've also seen people lighting candles as well. Many of them have been going throughout the night. It's after news that remains of an infant were found in woodland close to where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon were arrested on Monday evening. Now, that post-mortem examination is taking place right now to establish exactly what happened to that infant. And there's also going to be a forensic test to establish that that is Constance Martin and Mark Gordon's baby. But yesterday, police were granted an additional 36 hours to question the couple. They're currently being held on child neglect and gross negligence manslaughter, suspicion of both of those things. Now, that 36 hours comes to an end tomorrow, so we could see an extension of their time in custody, or we could see charges given to the couple. But as you can see, it is still a hub of activity behind me. Teams are still working very closely, going through the evidence of what is now a crime scene. Now, remember, this all started 7 weeks ago when Constance Martin and Mark Gordon's car was found burnt out on the M61 near Bolton, and police believed that Constance Martin had given birth in the back of that vehicle, or nearby at least, in the days prior to that incident. They were then seen on CCTV across the UK, and they were seen buying camping gear in East London on the 7th of January. And that really concerned officers, because they were worried then that the couples were seeking to live off-grid with this newborn baby, which had never been seen by a doctor or a midwife. Well, the couple were arrested on Monday evening here in Brighton after a member of the public spotted them from media campaign. She alerted the police. They were here within minutes, but the baby was not with them, and that caused a huge search operation which took place from Monday evening until Wednesday afternoon, involving over 200 officers from across 3 different forces. But we got that very sad news last night that the remains of an infant had been found very close to where the couple had been arrested, and the police are saying today they're asking for the public and the media not to speculate as to what happened to this baby. 2 people are under arrest, and officers say they are determined to get to the truth as to what happened here.
Indeed. Ellie, thank you very much indeed for that. And, of course, we'll update people as we get more from Sussex Police and the Met, who are carrying out the inquiry alongside them. Now, the third and final volume of the Manchester Arena inquiry to be published later. Sir John Saunders releasing his findings on whether or not the attack could have been prevented by the security services. He will also address the radicalisation of the suicide bomber Salman Abedi. Ahead of that, our reporter Sophie Reaper has been speaking to the mother of one of those 22 victims who lost their lives in that attack.
I remember my daughter waking me up, and then it all went crazy from there on, really. Yeah, and we got phone calls and text messages from his friends who were with him at the time. They all got out, but they were desperately looking for Martin.
On May 22nd, 2017, suicide bomber Salman Abedi detonated an explosive device at Manchester Arena, taking the lives of 22 people. Fegan's 29-year-old son, Martin, was just one of those killed. Today, the third volume of the Manchester Arena inquiry turns its focus to radicalisation and how this tragedy could have been prevented. What's your reaction to all of this? How did you feel after all of those failings?
Right from the word go, I have never really been angry. The only emotion I've ever felt right from the start is sadness. Everybody who's made a mistake is aware they made a mistake, and my view is that those people have to look in the mirror every morning with that on their conscience. So, that's a difficult thing to do. Mistakes were made, yes, but apologies were sincere, in my opinion, and I, for one, accept those apologies.
In fact, rather than feeling anger, Fegan has channeled the loss of her son into something that could potentially save the lives of others.
Martin's Law is basically a legislation that we are asking the government to put in to have security at venues, because up to this point, actually, there is no legislation to keep people safe at venue. It's just an option for the moment. Obviously, it's too late for Martin, but, I have 4 other children, I've got grandkids, and I want my family and I want everybody in this country to be able to go out and enjoy themselves, but still come home at night.
Sophie Reaper, GB News.
Well, let's get more live now with Sophie, who's in Manchester for us. And Sophie, just to explain to people, this is the third part of this pretty comprehensive inquiry. And this will address in detail what the security services, MI5 and others, knew, and perhaps whether there was an opportunity to stop Abedi.
Absolutely. This is the third and final volume of the Manchester Arena inquiry. Of course, looking at not only the failures on that night, but how we can now learn from all of those things that went wrong to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. The first volume came out in June of 2021. The focus there was on the failures made at the arena. At the time, the threat level for terrorism was severe, and the report found that they just weren't prepared enough. The second volume came out in November of last year. That was concerned with the failures of the emergency services. In fact, it found that if they had been better prepared, one of the 22 people killed may have survived. This afternoon, in less than 2 hours, we're expecting the publication of that third and final volume. As you say, that is concerned with not only the radicalisation of Salman Abedi, but also exactly what the security services knew ahead of time and whether or not this attack could have been prevented. Now, of course, on that night back in May of 2017, 22 people were killed, 22 families were forced to grieve as a result. We heard there from Fegan Murray, who lost her son Martin as a result of the attack. It's always a difficult time when these inquiry volumes are published, but it's widely accepted that the inquiry is so vital to learning from the mistakes that were made on that night.
Yeah, and another vital part of that grieving process for these people trying to understand what happened on that night. But Sophie, for the moment, thank you for that. Back to you, of course, and we're expecting the full publication coming up at around 2 o'clock, but reaction throughout the afternoon. Also coming up, Frog marched out of Frogmore. It seems royal merry-go-round, or is it musical chairs in Windsor? We'll have the latest on that and the SNP leadership race. But first, an update on all the headlines with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mark. It's 12:32. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The journalist who published texts by former Health Secretary Matt Hancock while he was in office has refused to apologise, saying the greatest betrayal is of the entire country. Mr Hancock gave his message to Isabel Oakeshott, his messages as they collaborated on his memoirs. She then passed them on to The Telegraph. The former Health Secretary says he's a victim of a massive betrayal. The paper claims Mr Hancock clashed with then Education Secretary Sir Gavin Williamson over schools during the COVID pandemic. Hancock reportedly said he was mounting rearguard action to close schools in December 2020. That's despite Sir Gavin fighting tooth and nail to keep them open. Minister for Schools Nick Gibb told GB News the pandemic meant making rapid and difficult decisions.
Those WhatsApp messages were messages where people were saying things in the heat of the argument. But I know Gavin Williamson very well. He respects teachers very highly. And of course, there are big decisions that were being made, very rapidly during that period about whether to keep schools open and so on. But ultimately, we rely on the medical evidence coming from the Chief Medical Officer and from the Department of Health in making those very important decisions.
The search for a missing baby in Brighton has ended after the remains of an infant were found in woodland last night. Police say the body was found close to where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon were arrested on Monday. They'd been evading authorities for more than 7 weeks, but refused to divulge information on the location or welfare of their baby. They're currently being held on suspicion of child neglect manslaughter. And the Home Secretary has reportedly blamed political correctness for creating what she calls a blind spot for Islamist extremists to operate under the radar. According to The Times, Suella Braverman said the entire concept of political correctness should be banished. Her comments come just hours before the release of a final report into the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, in which 22 people were killed. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Mark will be back in just a moment.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like.
Absolutely.
On Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, The People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Welcome back to GB News Live. Some breaking news coming up for you from a certain Boris Johnson. Now, we've been reflecting. We've not heard from the former Prime Minister in reacting to the Northern Ireland deal, the so-called Windsor Framework. Well, there he is at this Global Soft Power Conference, a summit talking about foreign affairs and world affairs. We were expecting some comment on Ukraine in particular, but he has actually spoken on the whole issue of the Windsor Framework, saying he will find it very difficult to vote for Rishi Sunak's Windsor deal, raising concerns, saying this is not about the UK taking back control. Now, it does seem that most backbenchers, the 1922 Backbench Committee, have certainly agreed to what Rishi Sunak is putting forward, although the ERG group of hard Brexit MPs are still assessing what the DUP will come out with, because their concern is about the so-called Stormont break, i.e. whether there is sufficient power to address what they see as EU law overriding the concerns of Northern Ireland and in particular the Unionist community. But certainly Boris Johnson indicating that he will find it very difficult to vote, and we are getting the indication there will be a Commons vote. But will his voice actually be in the minority? We shall see, but that conference continuing. More reaction as we get it. But to matters royal now. Another royal rumble, perhaps. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle confirming they've been asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage. Reports suggesting that Prince Andrew may be offered the keys instead. Well, the Sussexes said to be making arrangements to have their belongings moved to California, of course, where they reside now with their 2 children. Let's get the latest with our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, joining us in the studio. And Cameron, this has been sort of rumbling on the front pages for a day or two. Now, official recognition from California, they're out.
Yes, a spokesperson confirmed to me last night that they have indeed been asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage. Of course, and I say cottage, it's a 5-bedroom house on the guarded
it was several residents or workers' cottages that have been sort of put into one fairly big, well, as you say, more of a cottage, a house.
Yes, and when they were gifted the property by the Queen following their wedding, £2.4 million of our money, taxpayers' money, was spent renovating it. When they stepped back as working members of the royal family, Harry and Meghan did pay back that money, and it was understood they had some kind of commercial, they were paying some kind of commercial rent on the property. But nonetheless, it appears that the Crown Estate, who owns the property, has made the decision to essentially kick them out, which means they don't have a UK home. And The Sun and various other reports suggest that the King has sanctioned that. Perhaps he's got his king head on rather than the loving father head on.
And indication that perhaps that decision was made, or announced at least, the day after the publication of a certain book.
Yes, that is my understanding from various reports. It appears that the day after Harry released his memoir, Spare, where he in particular accused the Queen Consort of leaking stories, which we have had no confirmation of that from Buckingham Palace. They are not commenting on that. But we've always heard that the Queen Consort was Charles's red line.
Yeah.
The fact that Prince Harry clearly appears to have crossed said red line in Harry's memoir, Spare, perhaps suggests why the King decided to make the decision. But in terms of the family, away from the family scraps, which clearly relations I would suggest are at an all-time low, this could be the King being practical about things.
Yes, because it's empty. Well, I say empty, but I think that Andrew's daughter, what was it, Eugenie, was actually staying there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when Harry and Meghan decided to leave and move to California, Princess Eugenie and her husband Jack and their young son August moved into Frogmore Cottage, and they would essentially vacate when Harry and Meghan came back for the odd weekend or so for the Jubilee. They have since moved to Portugal.
Right.
So the property lies empty. Now, the King's probably thought, or the Crown Estate managers have thought, well, Prince Andrew, Princess Eugenie's father, lives in Royal Lodge, a massive 30-bed mansion. And he was gifted by the Queen 250 grand a year, reportedly, in terms of like an allowance. But the King is going to be cutting that allowance, which means he can't afford the upkeep of Royal Lodge. So the King's basically offered, according to reports, Frogmore Cottage to Prince Andrew.
Although we understand, obviously, that Prince Andrew will have had a fairly substantial inheritance from the Queen herself. And the reason that we are sort of analysing this, indeed, we do have an interest in this, in that the taxpayers' money, as you're saying, has been used to renovate and to actually maintain some of these properties. I mean, I guess the main question is, what happens to the £2.4 million that Harry and Meghan gave? Does the taxpayer have to reimburse them that money now?
Well, that is the question, which is not answered yet. And I think there are going to be pretty serious questions about that point, because, yes, £2.4 million of taxpayers' money was paid redoing it. Then, because they left as working members of the royal family, Harry and Meghan agreed to pay that money back. And you can see from a sovereign grant report in 2019 that they have indeed paid it back. But you're right, it is an issue which perhaps may be addressed.
The other thing is, it's fascinating, I know, for people to play this royal monopoly game. So if the Duke of York moves from Royal Lodge, which, as you say, is a huge mansion, to Frogmore, what then happens to that building? Is that where the Prince and Princess of Wales will actually end up? Because they're in, Adelaide Cottage, I think.
So they're in Adelaide Cottage, which is a 4-bedroom house, very close to Frogmore, actually. I think Prince Andrew would reluctantly move to Frogmore Cottage if indeed he was going to move there. But you're right, there have been some suggestions in the papers this morning that the Prince and Princess of Wales and their 3 children would move into Royal Lodge as, heir to the throne. I think the Mail was reporting that the play dates that Prince George, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis go on, the houses of their friends are a lot more grand than their actual house, bearing in mind they are, in the line of succession. I think to most people, their house is pretty nice as things stand. A 4-bedroom house on a private guarded Windsor estate, but there has been no confirmation.
And that's another key. And, just to reflect that the whole incident of Harry calling into question his security detail was the fact that Frogmore was able to be secured within Windsor Great Park.
Yes, so we know that Prince Harry is in the middle of a legal battle over the Home Office's decision not to allow him to pay for his own police protection when he's in the United Kingdom. Now, Frogmore Cottage is in the guarded perimeter of the Windsor estate, so the only place, from Harry's point of view, that he had guaranteed armed police protection with the correct firearms and intelligence, access to intelligence, was Frogmore Cottage, where we saw their daughter Lilibet spend her first birthday during the Jubilee celebrations. They stayed there in the weekend following Her Majesty the Queen's death, and now, in theory, as of the summer, they're not going to have a UK base.
Families, eh?
Yeah.
And we shall see what this has in terms of the reverberations for the coronation. Well, that's another question. Cameron, thank you for taking us through, as we say, the Royal Monopoly board game there. Now, let's just return to this breaking news of Boris Johnson talking at this conference. Just to remind you, he said he will find it very difficult to vote for the Prime Minister's Windsor deal, the Windsor framework, raising concerns about that, with the former Prime Minister saying this is not about the UK taking back control. Well, let's get more with Tom Harwood, who's still at Westminster. And Tom, we were just obviously reflecting earlier that we'd not heard from Boris Johnson on what Rishi Sunak had outlined to the 1922 committee and others. Thumbs down, it seems.
Well, a timid, maybe thumbs sideways from Boris Johnson, from a wide-ranging speech address to this conference today. He has tackled on this issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol head-on, and it's interesting to see it's not all rosy. There's a great deal of criticism for what he describes as this deal, this Windsor framework acting as a drag, as an anchor on the UK's ability to diverge regulatorily from the European Union, and saying that really this is not an ideal deal. However, on the other hand, Boris Johnson has also said today that people want a deal. They want this sewn up. He would find it difficult to vote for this deal, but he did not rule it out. In some ways, this is the same similar wrangling that we're seeing at the top of the DUP, that we're seeing within the ERG. As this legal text is poured over, there are issues with it. This isn't a rosy panoplia of happiness and bunnies and kittens and rainbows. This is a legal text with drawbacks and positives, and ultimately it will be a very fine decision for a lot of people in terms of whether they back it or not.
Yeah, and just looking on that, what Lord Dodds has said, a former deputy DUP leader, indicating that as far as he was concerned, there is still a border down the Irish Sea. There will not be free trade within the United Kingdom, therefore, he's concluded, lambasting the move, and basically it would cement in reality the situation. And others, I gather Kate Hoey, or Baroness Hoey, also saying that the deal is not quite what it seemed, over-egged by the Prime Minister. So there's still quite a few critics, but we had that indication from Rishi Sunak, this is the deal and it will go ahead, come what may.
Well, this is entirely within the gift, or largely within the gift, of the United Kingdom government. This doesn't actually need a vote of Parliament in order to pass. However, Rishi Sunak will probably feel that he had very little moral authority unless he offers that sort of vote to Parliament. But yes, the UK government and the EU can press ahead with most of this deal without even the say-so of a rekindled Stormont executive. So there are elements to this that really have already been signed and sealed. However, there is some growing discontent, really, with what this deal says, and there are those who say that any sort of border in the Irish Sea is anathema. Of course, what the deal does is have a sort of semi-border in the Irish Sea, a red lane for goods that look like they will go on to the Republic of Ireland. However, also a green lane that's less of a border, more free-flowing and less fettered trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland for those goods that will remain in Northern Ireland. So a sort of halfway house there, and for a lot of people that's quite a bit to stomach. However, for others this is a political achievement, achieving things that the EU said they would never do just a couple of years ago, but have acquiesced to in this deal.
So maybe just a few bunnies and rainbows and maybe the odd Peppa Pig, who knows. Thank you very much for that, Tom. But let's just actually update you with a little bit more coming through from the Northern Ireland Office Minister, Lord Kane, saying there are still details of the Stormont break yet to be filled in, telling peers in the Lords that consultation with Northern Ireland parties imminent and legislation will follow. Following comments in the Lords in terms of documentation and the framework and so on. So clearly it is still a work underway in Parliament. That's the situation at Westminster. What about north of the border in Holyrood? Well, Humza Yousaf has taken a swipe at his SNP leadership rival Kate Forbes over opposition to same-sex marriage. That was during the first party hustings in Cumbernauld. Yousaf saying that gay Scots would have to look the next First Minister in the eye and know they would advance their rights. Well, the race so far dominated by Kate Forbes, that evangelical Christian, by saying she would not have voted for same-sex marriage in the 2014 vote. Then on the question of whether someone of faith could rise to the top, the Health Secretary, Yousaf, mentioning gay rights without the issue actually being raised. And then the whole issue of Europe as well. Let's get the latest from Edinburgh and our Scotland reporter, Tony Maguire. And Tony, with all this coming out, of course, we reflect the SNP were trying to stop reporters from reporting what was going on in these hustings.
Yes, and I mean, to the credit of the candidates, they put themselves forward to be open to the full scrutiny of the Scottish media, and a lot of people were calling it a U-turn. I think it was more of a J-turn, if you think of the shape of the letter, because they allowed one broadcast journalist in from STV, and all credit to that cameraman who managed to catch absolutely everything with just one camera, and one print reporter. So they did stream the events on their social media pages last night, so people like myself could follow along, and I got to say, it was at first I thought it maybe started a little tame. Reminded that this wasn't a debate, it was a hustings, and this is a contest among friends. But certainly as the day went on, there were further issues, things like, plans for gender reform bill, and as you mentioned there, a Scottish version of the Windsor framework that Northern Ireland has just received, and I can just imagine the Ardnar Mahdi framework being announced this time soon. So yeah, I don't know. I think we've had, it was pretty amicable. This is just one of 9. The next one is due tomorrow in Fife and Rosyth, I believe. But I think what it did do is it showed us certainly the candidates, across a number of issues. Obviously, Kate Forbes was focused on finance, in terms of our reporting, and Humza Yousaf to health. So, yeah, it was very interesting exchanges between everyone. Certainly, Kate Forbes and Ash Regan calling each other out as being each other's best friends in politics, and then Humza Yousaf referring back to the old faithful excuse of his wife, who is also a councillor.
OK, so do you think that maybe this will soften their attitude to being more open in terms of these meetings going forward? Because clearly there are matters of real import here, particularly, you know, Scotland's relation with Europe after this, well, whether we call it the Windsor or the Cumbernauld framework now after this.
Yeah, I certainly think that, you know, there was a few different attitudes. Certainly Kate Forbes wanted to go all guns blazing for Westminster and demand. Humza Yousaf, his strategy was constantly reminding people of the people of Scotland how much damage he thinks Brexit has done to the country. And Ash Regan wants to join EFTA, you know, to create something new for the country in the meantime, obviously, because rejoining Europe may take upwards of 10 years. But of course, you know, a lot is said about the relationship between Scotland and Europe. But, you know, I think there's a lot of mending to get done here between Westminster and Holyrood as well. Tensions have been frayed, certainly, over the last decade. And I think, you know, we are all one United Kingdom. So I think that will certainly be on the priority list for a future hustings.
OK, thank you very much for bringing us that latest situation in Scotland. Tony, great to speak to you on that. Now, let's reflect on Ukraine. The latest we're getting is Russian missiles hit a 5-storey civilian building in the southern city of Zaporizhzhia, killing 3, wounding at least 4, according to Ukrainian police. And it seems a lot of the fighting at stalemate now. Let's speak to Con Coughlin, defence editor at the Daily Telegraph, joining us once more. Con, thanks for your time. We're still awaiting this major Russian spring offensive. It doesn't seem to be happening, being sort of bogged down in mud. And we've even got Ukrainian drones heading towards the Kremlin, it seems.
Yes, I mean, the conflict is taking a very interesting turn. First of all, as you said, this long-awaited Russian offensive, if it is happening, nobody seems to be noticing because the weather's turned. A lot of Russian tanks are bogged down in the mud. Which is what happened last year, if you remember, when they started the invasion in February last year. The whole offensive just ground to a halt very quickly because of the weather, which you'd have thought the commanders would have thought about. But also you're seeing a sort of change of attitude by the Ukrainians, because for the past year, the Ukrainian forces have concentrated their efforts in liberating Ukrainian territory. They've been fighting the Russians on Ukrainian soil. But in the last week or so, we've seen some very interesting developments. We've seen a Russian spy plane blown up in Belarus, which of course is an ally of Russia. And then over the weekend, it's been reported that Ukrainian drones were shot down on the outskirts of Moscow, apparently targeting a gas installation, which, you know, given how much the Russians have targeted Ukrainian infrastructure, I can see nothing wrong with the Ukrainians replying in kind and taking the war right to President Putin's doorstep.
Yeah, and very quickly, where does this leave Putin? I mean, we've seen him out and about, and we saw him at that rally in Moscow and so on. Still suggestions that perhaps he's not a well man.
Well, he's certainly not well in the head, if you want my opinion. I mean, we get these reports of a very isolated Russian leader who travels around on an armoured train with specially built stations so no one can get to him. He doesn't want to fly because he might be shot down. And when he's not at the Kremlin, he seems to be spending his time at some palace outside Moscow with his former gymnast lover. So, I mean, you know, for a man who's provoked one of the greatest crises in Europe since the Second World War, this kind of behaviour is just beyond the pale. And you do wonder about his mental state.
But thanks for joining us once more on GB News and bringing us your assessment. More, of course, as we get it from Ukraine and indeed from Moscow. More coming up on the Matt Hancock leaks as well. But first, look at the weather for you.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Most places having a dry day today, but there are a few showers across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Southern areas enjoying the sunniest skies. Still feeling pretty chilly where it stays grey. High pressure is dominating. Around the area of high pressure, the winds go clockwise. So feeding in quite a lot of cloud and a few showers from the North Sea into parts of eastern Scotland and a few for the east of Northern Ireland as well. So showers continuing in southern Scotland, but generally elsewhere it's dry. Quite a lot of cloud for Scotland, Northern England and Eastern England, but some spells of sunshine for Southern England and South Wales. Out of the breeze here. Feeling pretty pleasant with temperatures perhaps up to 11 Celsius. Where it stays drab, 7 or 8, will feel pretty chilly. Should see some good spells of sunshine again across westernmost parts of Scotland. Clear skies here will allow frost overnight. Temperatures dropping quickly under the clear skies in the southwest, but cloud generally spilling back in. A few showers may keep going over northern England and the east of Northern Ireland, but most will have a dry night. You can see that frost there across western Scotland. Further south, some pockets of frost if skies stay clear, but most towns and cities start Friday at 2 or 3 Celsius and a cold feeling cloudy day again for many, but we should see plenty of sunshine across Scotland, brightening up across southern Scotland, Northern Ireland as we go through the day. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud, a cloudier day in the south compared to today, but still temperatures might just about get at double figures. Generally these values are touched below average for this time of year. I'm feeling colder with a brisk breeze along some of these eastern coasts. Not a great deal of change during Friday night, or indeed as we go through the weekend. We are looking at some showery rain coming into the far north, and that is signs of colder air then pushing in through the weekend. So it is going to turn colder and colder still next week, with the possibility of some snow in places. Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Most places having a dry day.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank. My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's just gone 1 o'clock. You're with GB News Live this Thursday. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this lunchtime, Matt Hancock denounces what he says is a massive betrayal and breach of trust after the latest leaks of his lockdown WhatsApp messages. The allegations this morning, he tried to bypass Education Secretary Sir Gavin Williamson to have schools closed in December 2020. What does it all tell us about the way government was handling the crisis? Families to find out today if MI5 could have stopped the Manchester Arena bombing. It's expected we'll learn what the security services knew about Salman Abedi and if they had the opportunity to stop him before the attack. We're live in Manchester as those conclusions are released to the families. And is it another Royal Rumble kicking off? The Duke and Duchess of Sussex are asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage in Windsor. We're talking to the King's former butler, Grant Harold, who thinks Harry may retaliate. And get in touch with your take on all of today's top stories, gbviews at gbnews.uk. Before that, latest headlines coming up with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. It's 2 minutes past 1, your top stories from the GB newsroom. And breaking news in the last half hour, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has expressed concerns over Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. Speaking at the Global Soft Power Summit in Westminster, he said he'd find it very difficult to vote for the Prime Minister's Windsor deal, saying it's not about the UK taking back control. He also admitted he'd made mistakes in signing his Northern Ireland Protocol that caused the DUP to walk out of power sharing. Downing Street has said some people are misunderstanding the Windsor framework as the DUP and backbenchers continue to pore over the deal.
I, of course, have mixed feelings. I'm conscious of where the political momentum is and people's deep desire just to get on. And this has got to be about the people of Northern Ireland, the 1.9 million people, their businesses and their lives. And given that we have got rid of the bill, I can see why so many people are attracted to accepting a compromise.
Matt Hancock says he's a victim of a massive betrayal after more than 100,000 of his WhatsApp messages were leaked. The former Health Secretary handed over his text to journalist Isabel Oakeshott as they collaborated on his memoirs. She then passed them on to The Telegraph. The paper claims Mr Hancock clashed with then Education Secretary Sir Gavin Williamson over schools during the COVID pandemic. Hancock reportedly said he was mounting rearguard action to close schools in December 2020. That's despite Sir Gavin fighting tooth and nail to keep them open. Minister for Schools Nick Gibb told GB News the pandemic meant making rapid and difficult decisions.
Those WhatsApp messages were messages where people were saying things in the heat of the argument. But I know Gavin Williamson very well. He respects teachers very highly. And of course, there are big decisions that were being made, very rapidly during that period about whether to keep schools open and so on. But ultimately, we rely on the medical evidence coming from the Chief Medical Officer and from the Department of Health in making those very important decisions.
The search for a missing baby in Brighton has ended after the remains of an infant were found in woodland last night. Police say the body was found close to where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon were arrested on Monday. The couple had evaded authorities for more than 7 weeks and had refused to give any information on the location or welfare of their baby. They're currently being held on suspicion of child neglect manslaughter. The Home Secretary has reportedly blamed political correctness for creating what she calls a blind spot for Islamist extremists to operate under the radar. According to The Times, Suella Braverman was speaking at a counter-extremism conference where she said the entire concept of political correctness should be banished. Her comments come just hours before the release of a final report into the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing in which 22 people were killed. The report's expected to reveal details of the radicalisation of Manchester-born terrorist Salman Abedi. Teachers in Wales and the south of England are on strike today in a long-running dispute over pay. It's the third walkout by members of the National Education Union this week, with previous industrial action taking place in the north of England and the Midlands. The Education Secretary had invited teaching unions to take part in talks on the condition the strikes were suspended, but the unions are demanding a better pay offer first. Further national strikes in England and Wales are planned for March the 15th and 16th. The number of children and young people receiving urgent treatment for eating disorders in England has risen by 66% since 2019. The Royal College of Psychiatrists says services have been flooded with referrals. It's warning there's a postcode lottery of care and is calling for more staff to help ease the backlog. Abusive attacks on retail staff have almost doubled since before the pandemic. A survey by the British Retail Consortium found that over 850 incidents were recorded every day between 2021 and 2022. This includes racial and sexual abuse, physical assault and threatening with a weapon. Industry leaders are calling on the police and the courts to make tackling retail crime a priority. And high street retailer WH Smith says it's been the target of a cyber attack for the second time in a year. The firm says company and employee data have been accessed by the hackers, but it says trading activities haven't been impacted, nor have its website, customer accounts or customer databases, which are all on separate systems. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to Mark.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed. So, former Health Secretary Matt Hancock saying that these messages leaked to the Telegraph newspaper by journalist Isabel Oakeshott are a betrayal and a breach of trust. The newspaper being handed more than 100,000 WhatsApp messages from the height of the COVID-19 pandemic when Mr Hancock was serving as the Health Secretary. Well, in the past hour, Isabel Oakeshott has doubled down on her defence, saying it was overwhelmingly in the public interest to see this information, and earlier saying that she feared that the upcoming COVID inquiry would be a whitewash. That's actually been denied by the chairman of the inquiry, quite angrily. Well, more revelations expected in the newspaper in the coming days. Let's get more with our political correspondent Tom Harwood in Westminster. And Tom, clearly the paper's going to carry on, we understand, with this, but interesting that Isabel Oakeshott has taken time out again to say, I'm doing this in the public interest, not to have a go at Matt Hancock.
Yes, and after all, she will be saying that for some time to come, emphasising, driving home what, in her view, is the public interest case behind this. Because, of course, let's not forget, in order for these messages to be published, Isabel Oakeshott had to break a non-disclosure agreement, a legal agreement, a contract with Matt Hancock. And in order to justify the breach of that contract, there has to be a very strong cause of public interest. So it's why in the first day of these lockdown files, we saw a long editorial from Isabel Oakeshott saying exactly why she did it, why it was necessary for this information to be in the public domain sooner rather than later. And ultimately, that is what this rests on, because, of course, we do know this information has been handed across to the COVID inquiry. Matt Hancock handed all of those texts to the COVID inquiry some time ago, and so they will be, the ones that are relevant at least, will be in the public domain, or at least filtered through and looked through by that inquiry as time goes on. But the question that Isabel Oakeshott and others and the Telegraph are raising is, will that inquiry conclude soon enough to get those answers as soon as we need to learn the lessons? If, God forbid, another pandemic came along soon, we'd need those lessons sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and of course the indications are that it was pretty chaotic behind the scenes in terms of the government trying to address this. But we should reflect that the Hancock camp have come out quite aggressively, indicating that they think this is a biased account because of her own anti-lockdown agenda.
Yes, and this is a phrase repeated by Matt Hancock in all of his communications, that the messages that have been chosen to be presented, and in some cases Matt Hancock alleges doctored, with certain lines being left out, Matt Hancock says is to suit an anti-lockdown agenda. The Telegraph has been known to be critical of lockdown in the past. It's one of these papers that has looked about all the other aspects of what the pandemic policy did, and today it's focusing on the knock-on effects for the welfare of children through their education. Children, of course, not particularly affected by the virus, but massively affected by the restrictions that were placed upon them, and several lost years of schooling, certainly the exams fiascos that we've seen in recent years, that has a genuine impact on children. However, of course, the other side of that is that schools were clearly a vector of transmission for this disease, and there are many different decisions that need to be weighed up and clearly were actively debated within government, and we see that in the messages published today.
Now, we'll stay in Westminster, but not, of course, at Parliament, in terms of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who has broken cover at long last to talk about the Windsor framework. And this was at a soft power a speech or a sort of conference, saying he found it very difficult to actually vote for the Windsor deal.
Yes, Boris Johnson speaking at the Global Soft Power Summit today is breaking cover. We haven't heard from him for quite a long time. And in a very wide-ranging speech, he spoke about everything from corporation tax to Roald Dahl. He also gave his views on this Windsor framework agreed by the government between Rishi Sunak and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen back on Monday. Well, Boris Johnson isn't a massive fan of the agreement. He's saying that it could in certain ways act as a drag on UK regulatory divergence from the European Union. And he says that his preferred mechanism of the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, that unilateral move to disapply parts of EU law, is actually what got the EU to the table in the first place. Boris Johnson really defending his legacy in terms of those negotiations with the EU that actually began under his premiership. But at the end of all of that, even pointing to the many imperfections as he sees them in this deal, he says he will probably end up voting for it because people want to see an end to the years of wrangling and negotiating.
Yeah, although he's argued that this deal is not about taking back control, but of course perhaps trying to secure his legacy. Tom, as ever, thank you for that from Westminster. But let's now speak to Christopher Hope, Politics Associate Editor at the Daily Telegraph. And Chris, we were waiting to see what Boris Johnson would say and where and when. A soft power summit, but a pretty hard-edged message from him.
Well, kind of, isn't it? I mean, I think he's really having his cake and eating it. He's saying he's not sure if he can support it. That's trying to keep the ERG on side and the DUP. Don't forget, they're both deciding probably, well, ERG, if we think the end of next week, they'll come out with their ruling on whether this is Brexit or not. They've got the Star Chamber of Legal Experts looking at it. That's David Jones, Bill Cash, Barney Reynolds and Martin Howe, four quite senior MPs and lawyers. They're looking at it. The timing is fascinating, don't forget. MPs right now, Tory MPs are on their way to Windsor, to a hotel in Berkshire for a day of fun and games and an away day with Rishi Sunak. And Boris Johnson is going to that. So clearly this is a marker. He's put down a marker. He knows he's with MPs for the next 12 hours, 24 hours. He has now said where he is on Brexit. I wonder whether at the bar it might be quite awkward.
Yeah, and do you think this is more about him trying to sort of secure his position, his legacy over it, bearing in mind, I think that he may have, just in terms of a comment, an aside there, recognised that the way he handled it meant that the DUP pulled out of the power-sharing agreement?
I think that's totally right. He's really keeping his skin in the game on this. He wants to be the focus for any resentment over this bill. This deal, I should say, not a bill, a deal. I've talked to several ERG people, Brexiteers, the DUP. They are very concerned about the edges. They think it's been overspun by the government, and of course the government would say, well, why can't they? It's their deal. But there is concern, I think, about the level of paperwork required by firms in the Green Lane in Northern Ireland. Other major issues they've got about this, whether it's actually Brexit, the ECJ involvement, is it sovereignty, all these points. And I think they do need, and they will need, some kind of opposition person to go towards in the Tory party, and Boris Johnson could be lining himself up for that. I do think, though, he's having his cake and eating it at this stage.
Now, then, in terms of the mechanics, I know the Northern Ireland Office Minister Lord Kane's been speaking in the Lords, saying still details of the Stormont break yet to be filled in terms of the veto powers, but telling peers consultation with Northern Ireland parties is imminent and legislation will follow. And this is the other part of the equation. I mean, the indication from Rishi Sunak is this will go through no matter what the ERG and DUP come up with in terms of their dislikes.
Yeah, it all hangs on the definition of the word significant, because that will trigger what could we call the Stormont break. But of course, significant for one group is not for another group, and that's where I think the debate will happen. Ursula von der Leyen said, didn't she, in Windsor, how it would be used in exceptional circumstances, not all the time. The Stormont, the DUP might expect to be used a lot if they need it, but then it might be overwhelmed by legislation coming from Brussels, as the European Scrutiny Committee was. So I think all that is up for grabs and is not clear yet where that might end up. That's the concern from the DUP and ERG side.
Right, and we haven't got a date as yet as to when the vote will be in Parliament, and clearly Boris Johnson is trying to hedge his bets, as of course he did on the whole issue of Europe and Brexit, we remember originally. I mean, from what we saw at the 1922 committee, I mean, will there be a significant number? Because I think the ERG total is perhaps about, what, 40 in total?
I would say around 60 members of the ERG, but could go to 100 by some who might be signed up. The big risk here is the trap that Labour have set. Keir Starmer said, didn't he, on Tuesday, how we are going to support your deal to Rishi. But if Rishi Sunak can only get a deal through on Labour votes, that is a disaster. That means he is basically being held in power by a Labour government. Were that to happen, you might expect a no-confidence vote to be pushed by Labour purely as a stunt, have no chance to go through, and that's where we are. That's the concern, and that's why Sunak has to try and whittle down the opposition to low 20s and fewer than that to get the deal through with Tory votes and to push the ERG, the right-wing Brexit group, onto the outskirts of the party and say to them, I can govern without you.
OK, and last thought, Christopher, in terms of the pretty sort of chippy atmosphere on the back benches at Prime Minister's questions, they've clearly thought, well, this is good news, and perhaps we ought to try and grab hold of this and make the best of it ahead of an election.
Did you say chippy or chipper, Mark? I couldn't quite...
Well, perhaps a bit of both, according to which wing of the party you are. From my privileged spot in the House of Commons, looking down at Rishi Sunak, I could see what he couldn't see when he gave his statement out on earlier this week and the PMQs. There are a lot more happy people in the rump of the Tory party. The problem is there's around 20 Tory MPs who don't talk to the whips anymore, and that means that the actual majority is about 26, 27, 28. If more than that vote against it, then you could see the vote being lost by the Tory party and relying on opposition votes, and then it's not great for Rishi Sunak. But I've got to say one thing, he's up in the polls. He's at a 12-point bounce. It's looking better for Sunak than it did a week ago. OK, but all still about maths, which is interesting. Christopher, as ever, thanks for joining us. Yeah, thank you for the view from the maths table there at the Telegraph. Thanks very much indeed. And coming up, we'll be getting the latest in terms of the government standing on the economy, house prices. They're falling at the fastest annual rate since 2012. But don't panic, we're being told. Should we panic about the weather?
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Most places having a dry day today, but there are a few showers across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Southern areas enjoying the sunniest skies. Still feeling pretty chilly where it stays grey. High pressure is dominating. Around the area of high pressure, the winds go clockwise, so feeding in quite a lot of cloud and a few showers from the North Sea into parts of eastern Scotland and a few for the east of Northern Ireland as well. So showers continuing in southern Scotland, but generally elsewhere it's dry. Quite a lot of cloud for Scotland, Northern England and eastern England, but some spells of sunshine for southern England and South Wales. Out of the breeze here. Feeling pretty pleasant with temperatures perhaps up to 11 Celsius. Where it stays drab, 7 or 8. Will feel pretty chilly. Should see some good spells of sunshine again across westernmost parts of Scotland. Clear skies here will allow frost overnight. Temperatures dropping quickly under the clear skies in the southwest, but cloud generally spilling back in. A few showers may keep going over northern England and the east of Northern Ireland, but most will have a dry night. You can see that frost there across western Scotland. Further south, some pockets of frost if skies stay clear, but most towns and cities start Friday at 2 or 3 Celsius and a cold feeling cloudy day again for many, but we should see plenty of sunshine across Scotland, brightening up across southern Scotland, Northern Ireland as we go through the day. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud, a cloudier day in the south compared to today, but still temperatures might just about get at double figures. Generally, these values are touched below average for this time of year. I'm feeling colder with a brisk breeze along some of these eastern coasts. Not a great deal of change during Friday night, or indeed as we go through the weekend. We are looking at some showery rain coming into the far north, and that is signs of colder air then pushing in through the weekend. So it is going to turn colder and colder still next week, with the possibility of some snow in places.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know,
All
Kate
sorts of
Moss?
rumors. Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, about a fortnight to go before we get the budget. Lots of people doing their sums on, well, not the state of the nation, but the state of the economy. Latest figures, we've got house prices falling at the fastest annual rate since 2012. The first time in 3 years that it's been negative for February, representing the first annual decline in prices since the housing market reopened following the lockdown. Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey saying interest rates could rise further to slow the cost. Intervention from Boris Johnson, who we've reflected has been speaking in London today, urging Rishi Sunak to slash corporation tax to Irish levels or lower, ahead of that planned hike in that rate from 19 to 25% coming up in April. Well, let's get the thoughts now once more. Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research. Vicky, thanks for joining us. As we say, lots of people trying to work out what the economy is doing at the moment ahead of the budget. And Andrew Bailey was sort of trying not to frighten the horses a bit, as Bank of England Governor, saying pretty much as we expected.
Yes, it's really interesting what he's been saying. He said we shouldn't assume that interest rates are going to be going up, and we shouldn't assume that interest rates are going to be coming down. So he was basically telling the market that we're still looking at all this, so don't get too excited about one move or another. But I think the indication, nevertheless, is that perhaps we are very close to the peak in interest rates in this cycle, which would be good news. I mean, you mentioned the housing market. I mean, the problem has been, of course, that longer-term rates have gone up. They went up particularly after the Liz Truss at Quantum episode, when we had the mini budget, when interest rates, mortgage rates went up very significantly as yields went up in the bond market. But they've been coming down, and that's good news. And inflation, the indications are that inflation is also going to be slowing down a bit more slowly in the UK, unfortunately, than in other countries, but certainly it's moving in that direction. So he's saying, or perhaps the economy is already getting the sort of the news that we wanted it to slow down a little bit. That's how we get inflation down. So we may not need to do an awful lot more.
However, people will be looking at their pockets and what they're experiencing at the supermarket. We've heard about grocery inflation and food, and 17, even 18% in some things. And people were wondering, well, is this really inflation coming down and halving by the end of the year, as some have indicated? We're still paying a lot each day in just our everyday lives.
No, absolutely. And that's a bit of a problem, that when you look at the consumer at the end of the day, they are being affected quite significantly by what's going on at present, because, of course, food price inflation is rising very significantly. And as we know, we've got a number of shortages that are coming up in fruit and vegetables in particular, for all sorts of reasons, whether it's bad weather or whether it's got to do with Brexit. And that's a real issue. So the issue about house prices that you mentioned at the beginning, of course, it's affordability. What is happening right now is that because prices had gone up quite significantly, interest rates have gone up, even though they're coming down a bit. What people can afford, given everything else that's happening in terms of repaying those mortgages every month, has become a lot more difficult. So mortgage approvals are going down. So we are in a position where, in fact, the cost of living crisis and everything else that's come and hit everyone, including higher, of course, tax rates, and you talked about the budget coming up, have all affected people's ability to spend.
OK, last quick thought. As you say, the budget is looming. We've got Boris Johnson with another intervention asking Rishi Sunak to slash corporation tax to Irish levels or lower. And they have found this money back at the back of the sofa, some 30 billion that perhaps they don't have to borrow. Has he got wriggle room for the budget?
Well, he does a little bit. I mean, first of all, he's been collecting quite a lot on VAT and other taxes, and self-employment is really interesting. So the January figures were pretty good from that point of view for him. And of course, at the same time, because energy costs are going down, what he's going to have more space to do is possibly, extend some of the support given to households with energy prices. Now, that would be very good news if that were to happen. But of course, we don't know yet. So the idea, therefore, is that perhaps he can also do something on corporation tax. And of course, that would be the easiest thing for him to do, given that he doesn't have to reduce corporation tax. He just has to perhaps not increase corporation tax as much as would otherwise be the case.
Yeah, just steady as she goes. Vicky, thank you very much indeed for that. And of course, we'll see what emerges on March the 15th in that budget. Thank you very much indeed for your time. But let's turn back to the lockdown files, as the Telegraph is calling them, all those leaked WhatsApp messages and the inquiry, of course, into the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and what the government was doing behind the scenes. Well, let's speak now to Charles Persinger, whose wife Katie was a UK care home manager who actually died from COVID back in 2021. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Charles, and I expect you, like many others directly affected, will be combing through these messages, scratching your head about how the government was, trying to cope or failing, perhaps, as you may have assessed in tackling COVID.
Yeah, as bereaved families, we've definitely recognised the failure. It hasn't come as a surprise, if I'm completely honest with you. I think it's something people expected. It's just unfortunate it had to be leaked via the media as opposed to through the inquest itself, where it would have been a more appropriate way for that sort of thing to break.
OK, what do you make then of Isabel Oak's shot that the journalist concerned, saying, look, this really is of public interest, and quite clearly it is for you and all the other families, and it needed to get out as quickly as possible, bearing in mind that that public inquiry could take some time to report?
Yeah, no, I agree. It is in public interest. My concerns, and I think, is the way the information was leaked. I mean, it would have been far better if it had come out through official forms and maybe gone through our lawyers and stuff beforehand, and we could have been prepared to hear this, as opposed to having to see it revealed in the media. You know, it's rather disturbing and traumatic for our bereaved families.
And of course, the question as to whether you're getting the full picture, I guess, as a result of that.
Well, it's been a long time, you know. That's part of the inquest and why we've been fighting for it for the last 2 years, is to get some truth and accountability from the government. It's the very least those left behind deserve, and our loved ones. Really.
Yeah, and obviously to see if things could have been done better, and the issue, of course, as to whether, therefore, things could be better next time round if, God forbid, we get another pandemic of some kind.
Well, you know, the chances are fairly high. Pandemics were always a thing that I think government were aware of the risks initially, and failed to act accordingly. I'm hoping the inquest will teach the people who need to learn the lessons they need. I hope they're going to prioritize healthcare and the well-being of the country, you know, over personal self-interest.
What do you make of that assertion that was made originally about this protective ring being thrown around the care homes, which of course directly affects your experience. It may indicate, from what we've learned, that this was perhaps piecemeal at best.
Well, yeah, it was completely haphazard, wasn't it? I mean, I think everyone's starting to understand what we understood in the early days. It didn't take me long to realize when my wife and mother had died, there was no protective ring around care homes.
No.
I'm glad it's finally come into light. I just hope we do learn lessons. I hope the inquest highlights the truth. So we can do better next time.
I'm going to leave the most difficult question to last for you, Charles. How are you doing?
It's hard. It's been a 2-year fight. I've not stopped campaigning for the last 2 years. If it wasn't for me and a few friends from COVID-bereaved Families for Justice, we wouldn't have had an inquest in the first place. We fought 2 years for this inquest. We're core participants because of that. Representing over 6,000 families in the United Kingdom. Obviously, we're out there to support people. We're going to keep fighting for accountability and justice. I think it's important for the future of this country.
And that shared experience has brought you all together?
Our shared experiences is where the truth lies. I think our voices and our stories should be heard. They must be heard. Anything short of that won't do the inquest the service it deserves.
Charles Persinger, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us here on GB News, and wish you and, of course, all the others all the best. Thanks for sharing your story with us once more. Charles, whose wife Katie was a UK care home manager, died from COVID in 2021. And, of course, we'll keep you updated on the reaction to what the Telegraph's calling the lockdown files. But let's get an update now on all the other headlines. Rhiannon's waiting for us.
Thank you, Mark. It's 1:33. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has expressed concerns over Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. Speaking in Westminster earlier, he said he'd find it very difficult to vote for the Windsor deal. He also admitted he'd made mistakes in signing his Northern Ireland protocol that caused the DUP to walk out of power sharing. Downing Street has said some people are misunderstanding the Windsor framework as the DUP and backbenchers continue to pore over the deal.
I'm going to find it very difficult to vote for something like this myself, because I believed that we should have done something different. No matter how much plaster came off the ceiling in Brussels. And I hope that it will work. And I also hope that if it doesn't work, we will have the guts to deploy that bill again.
The search for a missing baby in Brighton has ended after the remains of an infant were found in woodland last night. Police say the body was found close to where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon were arrested on Monday. They'd been evading authorities for more than 7 weeks and refused to divulge information on the location or welfare of their baby. They're currently being held on suspicion of child neglect manslaughter. The journalist who published Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages has refused to apologise, saying it was in the national interest. The former Health Secretary gave his messages to Isabel Oakeshott as they collaborated on his memoirs. She then passed them on to The Telegraph. Mr Hancock says he's been the victim of a massive betrayal. Ms Oakeshott says the entire country has been betrayed. And the Home Secretary has reportedly blamed political correctness for creating what she calls a blind spot for Islamist extremists to operate under the radar. According to The Times, Suella Braverman said the entire concept of political correctness should be banished. Her comments come ahead of the release of a final report into the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, in which 22 people were killed. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere, Mark will be back in just a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, in the next half hour, the inquiry into the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing due to publish the third and final volume of its findings, this time on whether the attack could have been prevented. Our reporter Sophie Reaper spoke to the mother of one of those 22 victims who lost their lives in that attack.
I remember my daughter waking me up, and then it all went crazy from there on, really. Yeah, and we got phone calls and text messages from his friends who were with him at the time. They all got out, but they were desperately looking for Martin.
On May 22nd, 2017, suicide bomber Salman Abedi detonated an explosive device at Manchester Arena, taking the lives of 22 people. Fegan's 29-year-old son, Martin, was just one of those killed. Today, the third volume of the Manchester Arena inquiry turns its focus to radicalisation and how this tragedy could have been prevented. What's your reaction to all of this? How did you feel after all of those failings?
Right from the word go, I have never really been angry. The only emotion I've ever felt right from the start is sadness. Everybody who's made a mistake is aware they made a mistake, and my view is that those people have to look in the mirror every morning with that on their conscience. So, that's a difficult thing to do. Mistakes were made, yes, but apologies were sincere, in my opinion, and I, for one, accept those apologies.
In fact, rather than feeling anger, Fegan has channeled the loss of her son into something that could potentially save the lives of others.
Martin's Law is basically a legislation that we are asking the government to put in to have security at venues, because up to this point, actually, there is no legislation to keep people safe at venue. It's just an option for the moment. Obviously, it's too late for Martin, but, I have 4 other children, I've got grandkids, and I want my family and I want everybody in this country to be able to go out and enjoy themselves, but still come home at night.
Sophie Reaper, GB News.
Well, let's get more with Sophie now, joining us live in Manchester. And, of course, the family's gathering there, Sophie, because we're expecting the details in about 20 minutes or so. But just to reiterate, this is the third and final part. But looking in more detail about what MI5 might have known and perhaps what they might have done to stop this man.
Absolutely. This is always a difficult day for those families. It's almost been 6 years now since that horrendous attack was carried out at Manchester Arena. This is the third and final part of that inquiry. The first part came out all the way back in June of 2021. That focused on the arena and the various failings there. The threat level for terrorism at that time was severe, and the report found that they just weren't prepared enough. The second part came out November of last year. That was focused on the emergency services and the various failings there, and that found that in fact if they had been more prepared, one of the 22 people killed probably would have survived. Today, in the next half an hour or so, we're expecting the findings of that third part of the inquiry. Like you say, it's focused on the radicalisation of Salman Abedi and what security services knew in advance, whether or not this attack could have been prevented. Now, as this inquiry winds up and comes to a close, it is a difficult time. We heard Martin's mother there talking about the emotion she's experienced since losing her son. It's such a difficult time, but the inquiry is so vital in finding out exactly went wrong and exactly how we can prevent something like this, a tragedy on a huge scale like that, from ever happening again.
Sophie, for the moment, thank you. Back to you, of course, as soon as we get those details expected at the Magistrates' Court then the next 20 minutes or so. Sophie Reaper updating us there in Manchester. Now to matters royal, with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex being asked to vacate their UK home just weeks after Harry's book Spare was published. Harry and Meghan's spokesperson said a request had been made for the couple to give up Frogmore Cottage in Windsor. Reports claiming that move sanctioned by the King to remove their remaining foothold in the UK. And that will mean their ties, of course, with the royal family are perhaps, semi-detached at least. The home on the grounds of Windsor Castle reportedly being offered to Prince Andrew instead, although that's not been officially confirmed. Well, joining us now is our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, who's been following this with obviously quite a few front pages of following it. But we now have confirmation from California. Yes, they're out.
Yes, we do. A spokesperson confirmed to me last night that Harry and Meghan have been asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage. We think it's going to be around the time of the coronation, either just before or just after, which clearly calls into question, are Harry and Meghan actually going to turn up to this coronation? So the couple paid £2.4 million back to the British taxpayer who paid to have the property done up following their wedding, but clearly having stepped back as working members of the royal family, they decided to pay it back because they were no longer working in the interests of the state on behalf of the King. But I think what's interesting is the timing of this decision, because the Crown Estate, who owns Frogmore Cottage, made the decision that they were going to ask Harry and Meghan to leave. But reportedly, it's been sanctioned by the King. And the date in question is the day after Harry released his memoir Spare, which went into some detail about allegations of Queen Camilla essentially planting stories within the press to increase her, public profile. And we'd always been told that Camilla would be Charles's red line.
Yeah. OK, so let's look at the consequences of this, because, I mean, there is an interest in that so much taxpayers' money has been expended on these various properties. The other part of the, as we described it, this Royal Monopoly Board, is that we've got Prince Andrew at Royal Lodge, this huge mansion, also in Windsor Great Park. Suggestions are he would be moved to Frogmore, and there we assume maybe the Prince and Princess of Wales would move into Royal Lodge, because they're in a fairly modest house at the moment.
Yeah, the Prince and Princess of Wales are in a 4-bedroom house, Adelaide Cottage, on the guarded Windsor estate. Prince Andrew has been in Royal Lodge for many years. He received, and as far as I can tell, still receives a 250 grand annual allowance, according to reports. But the report suggests that King Charles is going to cut that, which means Prince Andrew, his brother, can no longer afford the upkeep of Royal Lodge. So the suggestion is that he will move into Frogmore Cottage once Harry and Meghan has vacated it. Reports suggest that Prince Andrew is very reluctant to do so, but nonetheless it does leave the prospect of perhaps Will and Kate and their family being able to move into Royal Lodge eventually. However, that's not been confirmed by Kensington Palace.
No, and the timing of this ahead of the coronation and the signals being sent, I mean, this does indicate perhaps about the fracture in the relationships across the Atlantic.
Yeah, I think it definitely gives another card for Harry and Meghan to play in terms of playing the victim narrative. From my understanding, and I know for a fact, official invitations for the coronation have not gone out yet.
Ah, right,
and
OK.
they're not going to go out official invitations, we think, until much closer to the time. However, we are expecting save-the-date invitations to go out in the next couple of weeks or so. So I'm sure in the next couple of weeks I would be very surprised if sources close to the Sussexes do not let slip if they have received an invitation. I think it's highly likely they'll receive an invitation.
Yeah.
But following the spokesperson's comments last night, I think it's more unlikely than it was previously that they will actually attend the coronation, because they all see it as they have no space to safe space to stay in the UK.
We got nowhere to stay.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
There were several rooms in several palaces. So
yeah, a few in Kensington Palace may be available.
No, but the issue is, of course, that the family relationships are so low. Will they be allowed to stay in a palace that's occupied by another family member?
Families, eh? Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's now bring in Grant Harold, former butler to King Charles, with his thoughts. And Grant, we remember that Frogmore was a gift from the Queen, of course, to Harry and Meghan, and that Royal Lodge as well was, I think, a favourite of Prince Charles as he was then, because the Queen Mother lived there. So, you know, this is all quite personal for the King, I guess.
Good afternoon, Matt. Yeah, it absolutely is. It's a bit of a tricky one, if I can say that, because Royal Lodge was obviously the home of the Queen Mother. That's where one of her homes. And when she passed, the Queen and obviously other members of the royal family decided that Prince Andrew would continue to live there. And from what I understand, he lives there with Sarah Ferguson. And it's really tricky, this, because obviously the reports that Prince Harry, or it's obviously been confirmed that Prince Harry is going to be leaving his cottage, Frogmore. As you mentioned, it was gifted by the Queen, so it's got personal connections as well as practical reasons as to why this is happening. So it's quite emotional for them.
Yeah, and obviously security is a concern in that this is within Windsor Great Park. But I know a lot of people have questioned the other part of the equation. You know, why does Prince Andrew need I think it's 30 bedrooms, is that Royal Lodge? A huge sort of mansion with its own swimming pool and so on.
It is quite a substantial residence, and I think now that he is no longer a senior member of a working member of the royal family, this is obviously what's been discussed is with the accommodation, obviously having to look at what is required, what they need. And it doesn't surprise me. I mean, there's been rumours for a while that the Prince and Princess of Wales might move into a larger residence. This would be the perfect residence for a future king, because, as I mentioned, it was the home of the Queen Mother. And again, the fact that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex don't spend much time in the UK, again, it's a sensible reason for them to move out. But it could also be, if we're being factual about this, it could also be partly, I don't like the word retaliation, but with everything that's gone on recently, it might have made the decision for the king and obviously his advisor that might have made it an easier decision for them to ask them to leave the cottage. But again, it's a difficult decision because it was gifted by the Queen.
I was going to ask you, actually, who would make that decision? I mean, is it actually just within the King's gift, or is there, for instance, with the Crown Estate, a panel that has to decide? Because obviously there are consequences then about the maintenance and all the sort of rental agreements and so on.
You're quite right, Matt. There's, with any of these kind of things, there's always, that's a good word, a panel. There's always people there to advise and to keep the king right. And even though it's a difficult decision, but they will go to him with the facts. Obviously, there's lots we looked at, as well as, you're quite right, what it costs to run these properties. And then he's got to make the decision, and he's got to be a bit detached from it. It's really difficult. Obviously, we're talking about his son and, again, his brother, but he has to be a little bit detached, and the advisors are there to advise him. But ultimately he has the final say in it, I suppose you can say. He's the one that has got to agree to it, which is obviously what is happening.
Yeah, and of course us as taxpayers have a bit of an insight as well, bearing in mind that we pay for some of the repairs and renovation. However, Grant, thank you very much for joining us once more on GB News. Good to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed. Now, let's reflect on the latest events down in Brighton, with that post-mortem continuing on the remains of a baby discovered by police there following their search for missing child of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon. The couple facing further questioning today after a magistrate granted police permission to hold them for a further 36 hours on suspicion of manslaughter by gross negligence. So our reporter Ellie Costello has been updating us with the latest.
Well, this is clearly not the outcome that anyone wanted, and it has shocked the community here near Brighton. We've seen flowers being laid by residents, and also candles were lit overnight, which are still burning bright now. And it comes after the very sad news last night that the remains of an infant were found in Woodland, close to where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon were arrested on Monday evening. And now there is going to be a post-mortem examination to determine exactly how that infant died, and also there will be a forensic test to establish if it is Constance Martin and Mark Gordon's baby. Now, yesterday the police were granted an additional 36 hours to question the couple. They are currently being held on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. Now, that started yesterday and it will end tomorrow morning. We could see an extension of their time in custody, or we could see them being charged, but obviously any charges could be announced between now and then. But the police vans are still here behind me in Brighton, and the work is still continuing, with teams combing through evidence of what is now a crime scene. Now, this all started 7 weeks ago when Constance Martin and Mark Gordon's car was found burnt out on the M61 near Bolton, and police believe that she may have given birth just days earlier in the back of that car, or at least close to that vehicle. And then the couple was seen on CCTV across the UK, including Essex and London, where they were spotted on CCTV buying camping gear on the 7th of January. And that really concerned officers, because it looked as though this couple was planning to live off-grid with their newborn baby, who hadn't been seen by medical professionals. Well, the couple were arrested on Monday night after a member of the public recognised them from media campaigns, and she alerted the police, who were then on the scene within minutes, but they were without their baby. So then a search began on Monday evening for that infant, and sadly we have that news yesterday that an infant's remains have been found in Woodland, close to where the couple were arrested. But the investigation continues, and those two people are in custody.
Ellie Costello updating us then. Of course, as we get more from Sussex Police, we'll update you on that. The post-mortem's still going on. Now, today, the 26th annual World Book Day, UK and Ireland only, for the celebration of books and reading. Well, many children, of course, turning up to school with their favourite book characters today, some dressed as those, indeed. However, last week, of course, that controversy as publisher Puffin made a U-turn on the decision to remove language from author Roald Dahl's books, including Matilda, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and other favourites, which could be deemed as offensive. Apparently fat and ugly verboten at that time. Well, let's speak now to Heather Brunksell-Evans, an academic and author, joining us. And thank you very much indeed for joining us with a wonderful bookcase behind you, packed with tomes, which is good to see. It's interesting, isn't it, Heather, that at the moment the whole issue of reading and authors and language is actually in the news because of what the publishers have been doing.
Yes, the publishers, of course, are being bound by the general context in which everyone is afraid to say anything in case we're offending somebody, or speech is to be banned for this reason or for the other. And so, of course, they're now employing sensitivity readers.
Yeah, and clearly concerned about younger readers and what they're exposed to. But isn't that the whole point, that, you know, children actually like being challenged and shocked and stimulated and have their thoughts stirred for them?
Look, if we want to live in a society in which we bring up healthy children, what we need to do is expose children to a whole range of different ideas, excite them about reading, stop banning books, and allow children to just get on with it. And there you go. I mean, creating an atmosphere around children where we are treating them, trying to wrap them in cotton wool, will not ultimately be helpful for children, either for their reading, their pleasure in reading, or for their mental health, for that matter.
Yeah, and let them make their own minds up. Well, thank you for joining us. Apologies, I know we've had problems getting the signal to you, but great that we caught up to you, and apologies for cutting it short, but we'll speak again at some time. And, of course, turn another page, as they say. Thanks for your time. Just to alert you, we're coming up to 2 o'clock when we'll be heading back live to Manchester, to the court there for the latest on the third stage of the Manchester Arena inquiry. All that coming up for you in a moment.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Most places having a dry day today, but there are a few showers across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Southern areas enjoying the sunniest skies. Still feeling pretty chilly where it stays grey. High pressure is dominating. Around the area of high pressure, the winds go clockwise, so feeding in quite a lot of cloud and a few showers from the North Sea into parts of eastern Scotland and a few for the east of Northern Ireland as well. So showers continuing in southern Scotland, but generally elsewhere it's dry. Quite a lot of cloud for Scotland, Northern England and eastern England, but some spells of sunshine for southern England and South Wales. Out of the breeze here. Feeling pretty pleasant with temperatures perhaps up to 11 Celsius. Where it stays drab, 7 or 8. Will feel pretty chilly. Should see some good spells of sunshine again across westernmost parts of Scotland. Clear skies here will allow frost overnight. Temperatures dropping quickly under the clear skies in the southwest, but cloud generally spilling back in. A few showers may keep going over northern England and the east of Northern Ireland, but most will have a dry night. You can see that frost there across western Scotland. Further south, some pockets of frost if skies stay clear, but most towns and cities start Friday at 2 or 3 Celsius and a cold feeling cloudy day again for many, but we should see plenty of sunshine across Scotland, brightening up across southern Scotland, Northern Ireland as we go through the day. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud, a cloudier day in the south compared to today, but still temperatures might just about get at double figures. Generally, these values are touched below average for this time of year. I'm feeling colder with a brisk breeze along some of these eastern coasts. Not a great deal of change during Friday night, or indeed as we go through the weekend. We are looking at some showery rain coming into the far north, and that is signs of colder air then pushing in through the weekend. So it is going to turn colder and colder still next week, with the possibility of some snow in places.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, The People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Very good afternoon. It's just gone 2 o'clock here with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this afternoon, families to find out shortly if MI5 could have stopped the Manchester Arena bombing. We're live in Manchester as the conclusions are released, and find out if the security services knew about Salman Abedi and whether indeed they had the opportunity to stop him before that attack. In addition, we're being told there'll be a minute's silence. Also coming up, the latest fallout from Matt Hancock's leaked messages with unions hitting out Sir Gavin Williamson. But let's head back now to Manchester, because we are now getting the release of those details coming up and the minute's silence being held now. This is Sir John Hancock, who is the chairman.
So that marks 1 minute. Would everyone now please sit?
In this, the final open volume of my report, I deal with 3 topics: the radicalisation of Salman Abedi, the planning and preparation for the attack by Salman Abedi and Hashim Abedi, and whether the attack could have been prevented by the security service and counter-terrorism policing. While most public interest will focus on whether the attack could or should have been prevented and the role of the security service, the significance of the other 2 topics should not be underestimated. It is important that we understand as much as we can about the radicalisation of Salman Abedi, so that similar signs can be recognised and appropriate action taken. It is also important that we know in detail about the preparations for the attack, so that measures can be brought which would have prevented the killers acquiring the knowledge and materials they needed to carry out the attack. Radicalisation. The inquiry heard evidence from Dr. Wilkinson. His evidence detailed the differences between followers of mainstream Islam, who are the overwhelming majority and are accepting of and exist peacefully alongside people of different faiths, and those he identified as violent Islamist extremists, who believe in a narrow in-group, who believe they are the only ones with the correct world view. They are prepared to use violence against members of out-groups, which includes anyone who is not part of the in-group, including mainstream Muslims. It is important that I emphasise, as did Dr. Wilkinson, that the violent Islamist extremists are a tiny group who have adopted a distorted view of Islam based on an incorrect interpretation of the Quran. Dr. Wilkinson outlined what he believed were the various influences that had contributed to Salman Abedi's radicalisation. He concluded that by 2017, every conceivable radicalising malign presence and noxious absence existed in Salman Abedi's life. He said, "I have never seen such a complete picture of the Petri dish absolutely brimming with germs." I consider that Dr. Wilkinson's evidence was important. His perspective of the significance of behaviours exhibited by Salman Abedi was on occasions different from that of the security service and counter-terrorism policing. I would hope that his evidence will be considered with care by the relevant authorities to see what knowledge can be gained to assist in the correct identification of individuals who are at risk of being radicalised. I have concluded that there were a number of contributing factors to Salman Abedi's radicalisation. His family background and his parents' extremist views, along with their participation in the struggle in Libya, played a significant part. That struggle involved people who were radical, violent extremists. During the time Salman Abedi and Hashim Abedi spent in Libya, during which they were probably involved in fighting, they are likely to have come into contact with a number of violent extremists. It is likely that those extremists, including members of the Islamic State, who would be in a position to provide the brothers with expertise in making of bombs and in carrying out counter-surveillance measures. As leading counsel for the inquiry said during one of the hearings, how was someone of Salman Abedi's limited intelligence and abilities able to succeed in committing this atrocity despite any safeguards which were in place? The likely answer is he was provided with help. I have not been able to obtain a complete picture of the part Salman Abedi and Hashim Abedi's family played in their radicalisation, nor of what happened while they were in Libya. That is because other members of their family, namely their parents and brother, were not willing to give evidence to the inquiry. Salman and Hashim's parents were invited to provide statements but declined to do so. As they are currently out of the jurisdiction, there were no further steps that I could take. Ismail Abedi, who was in the country at the time I requested a statement, managed to leave the United Kingdom so that he didn't have to provide information which he was in a position to give. I have included in the recommendations section of Volume 3 some suggestions which I hope will make this more difficult for important witnesses in the future. Whether, if I had succeeded in getting Ismail Abedi into the witness box, he would have assisted the inquiry is very doubtful. What I was not prepared to do in the circumstances of this case was to invite the Attorney General to grant him immunity from prosecution in relation to any evidence he gave to me, in order to encourage him to speak. If he was involved in the plot, it would be quite wrong for him to have any protection from prosecution and punishment. There were other extremists, most of whom came from the same area of Manchester as Salman Abedi, and probably played a part in Salman Abedi's radicalisation and/or confirming him in his views once he had committed to violent extremism. One of those is Abdul Rauf Abdullah. A series of messages, over 1,000 in number, between Abdul Rauf Abdullah and Salman Abedi, sent during November 2014, were recovered as part of Operation Oliban, which was the counter-terrorism policing investigation which resulted in the prosecution and conviction of Abdul Rauf Abdullah for terrorist offences. Those messages talk of martyrdom. They were highly significant in the view of Dr. Wilkinson as demonstrating the influence that Abdul Rauf Abdullah had over Salman Abedi and the development of his violent extremist mindset. Salman Abedi was not identified as one of the participants in this exchange of messages until after the attack, and I have concluded on the balance of probabilities the messages were not passed to the security service by counter-terrorism policing as they should have been. My investigations, however, have demonstrated that even if Salman Abedi had been identified and the messages had been sent to the security service, it would not have affected their view of Salman Abedi. I have not criticised that view taken by the security service, but there is a learning point which could usefully be pursued, which is that the attitude of the security service to those sort of messages might be informed by the considerations which Dr. Wilkinson applied. We know that Salman Abedi visited Abdul Rauf Abdullah in prison, and also that they communicated by phone, including by use of an illegal mobile phone which Abdul Rauf Abdullah had in prison. It was apparent from the evidence that while prisons were alert to the problem of known radicalizers influencing other prisoners, they paid little, if any, attention to the risk that such prisoners, who may have had a hero status to some, would take the opportunity to radicalize visitors or encourage those who were already radicalized in their beliefs. There is no evidence that Abdul Rauf Abdullah played any part in plotting the attack, but it is likely, in my view, that he provided support for Salman Abedi's ideological beliefs and increased Salman Abedi's resolve to carry out the attack. It is important that the prison authorities do take notice of the risks that those in prison for terrorist offences, such as encouraging others to go and fight abroad, may seek to radicalise their visitors as well as other prisoners, or at least support their radical views. The government's response to the risks of radicalisation is the PREVENT programme. A review of that programme by William Shawcross has just been published and the government has responded to it. Because of that report, I did not carry out an assessment of the effectiveness of the PREVENT programme during my inquiry. It would have been beyond my terms of reference to do so. The Shawcross report does deal with issues of the Abedis and PREVENT, and notes that neither of them were referred to PREVENT. The Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament noted the same thing with surprise. I have looked in detail at the various occasions when Salman Abedi could have been referred to PREVENT. I have concluded that he should have been. I heard evidence that his referral was considered at one stage, but he was not considered suitable. There can be no guarantee that Salman Abedi or Hashim Abedi would have agreed to participate in the PREVENT programme. Their elder brother, Ismail, refused to engage in any way with counter-terrorism policing officers when they went to speak to him in 2015. I have concluded that there was at least a period during Salman Abedi's journey to violent extremism when he should have been referred to the programme. It is very hard to say what then might have happened. I have looked at whether the various educational establishments and mosques that Salman Abedi attended should have appreciated that he was moving towards violent extremism and notified the relevant authorities. I consider that it would have been very difficult for any of the educational establishments to have become aware of his developing extremism. One of the problems that I have identified is that while over the period of his education at different establishments, Salman Abedi showed worrying signs which could have been related to extremist views, there is no record which goes with the student which would allow anybody to consider all those signs together. Having a record which passes from school with a student to college or university may well be contentious, and deciding what material to include would also be difficult. Nevertheless, I do consider that it is something which should be looked at to see if a solution can be found. Another very contentious part of the evidence concerned the Manchester Islamic Centre, also known as the Didsbury Mosque, which Salman Abedi attended on some occasions. I consider it unlikely, having considered all the evidence, that Salman Abedi was radicalised at the Didsbury Mosque, but some of the evidence given on behalf of the mosque about the association of the Abedi family with the mosque was unsatisfactory. It looked as if the Didsbury Mosque was trying to distance itself from the Abedi family in a way which I did not accept was accurate. The reality, in my view, was that the Didsbury Mosque did have a significant number of attendees who were connected to Libya, but were attached to opposite sides in the conflict. Didsbury Mosque tried and largely succeeded in providing a broad church where both sides of the conflict could worship together. Although conflicts were generally avoided, this did on occasions lead to tensions between the two sides. The evidence given on behalf of the Didsbury Mosque could have been more helpful in enabling me to get to the truth. The Charity Commission has already prescribed a programme that the Didsbury Mosque must put in place. I hope that they will read my report and consider whether anything more needs to be done. For reasons that I've already given, I have not commented on the effectiveness of Prevent as a programme. It should be noted, however, that during my inquiry, several senior police officers spoke highly of it as a programme and how successful it can be in some cases. William Shawcross did comment on the radicalisation of Salman Abedi in his report. He did not have the benefit, as I did, of an intensive investigation into Salman Abedi's case, nor did he have the benefit of hearing from witnesses in closed session in order to resolve contentious issues. Insofar as William Shawcross's short passage in his report dealing with Salman Abedi does not agree entirely with the conclusions that I have reached, I would suggest that this is because of the much greater opportunity that I have had to listen to and test the evidence. Planning and preparation. While this part of my report is largely a narrative of events, it is nevertheless important. It is important that what was done by Salman Abedi and Hashim Abedi in preparation for the attack is understood in detail. Only by doing that is it possible to understand where the weaknesses are in the provisions that try to prevent people acquiring the necessary ingredients for a bomb and information about how to construct it. It is important that the opportunities for obtaining precursor chemicals are as limited as possible without preventing entirely innocent members of the public conducting their lives without undue difficulty. This part of the report is based almost entirely on the work of the Operation Manteline team, to whom I am very grateful. This investigation into the attack conducted by Greater Manchester Police was, as far as I am concerned, of a very high quality. It resulted in the conviction of Hashim Abedi for the murder of the 22 people who died and the attempted murder of many more who attended that night. I am as satisfied as I can be that the brothers made use of an instructional video placed on the internet by the so-called Islamic State to create their bomb. As much as possible needs to be done by the authorities to ensure that instructions for murder, such as these, are not put on the internet, and if they are, they remain there for the minimum amount of time. Further, it is important that the regulations requiring the reporting of unusual sales of precursor chemicals are continually kept under review and are as stringent as possible. That is not easy to achieve, and it needs to be made clear that unusual purchases need to be reported promptly. None of the purchases of precursor chemicals obtained by the brothers were reported to the authorities. That is a situation which should not have arisen. Had they been reported, it is possible that Salman Abedi could have been stopped. I have considered the parts played by others in the obtaining of those precursor chemicals and other acts which assisted the brothers in their preparation. All of this was carefully investigated by the police as part of Operation Manteline, and the evidence was reviewed by the Crown Prosecution Service to consider whether prosecutions could be brought. Some of the people are still under police investigation, but so far no further prosecutions have been brought. The issue in almost every case is whether the person who in fact provided help to the brothers in their preparations can be proved to have known what they were providing help for. There will inevitably be suspicion and in some cases there will be more suspicion than in others. It is not my job to review the charging decisions of the police or the Crown Prosecution Service, but for what it is worth, I agree with the decisions that they have made. I do not consider it is appropriate for me to accuse individuals of serious criminal offence where they can't be proved to the appropriate criminal standard. So I have not gone further than setting out the way in which various individuals assisted the brothers. I am confident that if evidence is found which justifies the prosecution, then the police and the Crown Prosecution Service will take the appropriate action. Preventability. Finally, in my report, I deal with the issue of whether the attack should or could have been prevented by the Security Service and counter-terrorism policing. I have reported fully on those matters in the closed part of Volume 3 of my report, which will be seen by those who are best placed to ensure that mistakes which were made are not repeated. In the open part of Volume 3, I have included all matters which I can safely include without jeopardising national security and making our community less safe. I have set out how I've approached the issue of national security, and I shall not repeat it now, except to say that where it has been possible, without risking national security, to make public the evidence that I heard enclosed, I have done so. What I have been able to set out in the open part of Volume 3 is that I have found a significant missed opportunity to take action that might have prevented the attack. It is not possible to reach any conclusion on the balance of probabilities or to any other evidential standard as to whether the attack would have been prevented. However, there was a realistic possibility that actionable intelligence could have been obtained which might have led to actions preventing the attack. The reasons for this missed opportunity included a failure by the Security Service, in my view, to act swiftly enough. I am aware that revealing what I have revealed in Part 24 of my report will leave many people, and particularly the bereaved families, wanting to know more. All I can say is that I have done my best to reveal what I can. Had we not had closed hearings, I would not have been able to make the findings that I have been able to make. Closed hearings, I am convinced, were entirely necessary as part of this inquiry if it was going to achieve its aims. The consequence of that, however, is that I have not been able to reveal some of the evidence on which my findings are based, as to do so would have risked breaching national security. While I have been critical of some of the ways that the Security Service and counter-terrorism police dealt with the information that they had or could have had in this case, I also recognise the very difficult job they have to do, and I acknowledge their success in uncovering a large number of plots against people in this country. I will make a number of closed recommendations to try and ensure that improvements are made in the way that the Security Service and counter-terrorist policing deal with the intelligence that they get. While I intend to monitor the recommendations in the open Volume 3, I consider that the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament are the most suitable body to monitor any closed recommendations that I make. They have already investigated the attack and made recommendations. They are in the best position to take an overall view and ensure that steps are taken to make improvements. They also have the important benefit that they will be in a position to carry on their monitoring over a long period of time. Because this is my final open report, I have set out my gratitude to all the people who have worked so hard on this report. The lawyers, the organisations who have responded to endless requests for information, those behind the scenes who have enabled the inquiry to keep going even in difficult situations, and I include in that the providers of the technology which has made it so much easier to conduct this inquiry. And of course, I thank the many, many witnesses who have given evidence to me. All have worked very hard. I am personally especially grateful to counsel and solicitors to the inquiry, without whose expertise I could not have completed what has been a very onerous task. Generally, in conducting this inquiry, I have been greatly impressed and grateful for the genuine intention and aspiration held by so many to make a difference and to try and ensure that nothing like the Manchester Arena attack ever happens again. Some of the evidence has been inspirational, showing humanity at its best. Some of it, when recounting the activities of Salman and Hashim Abedi, has shown humanity at its worst. A significant part of the evidence heard by this inquiry has been gruelling and distressing to listen to. For example, the evidence of people who were there, did their best to help, who will be affected for the rest of their lives by what they saw and heard. The evidence of the bereaved families, of the effect that the deaths of their loved ones has had on their lives, and who could fail but be moved by the tributes of the families to those who died. Those who were young were so full of promise. Those who were older were achieving that promise, and all of them were the cornerstones of their families. What an appalling loss, which was so unnecessary. Amongst all that grief, we should try and remember the positives as well, along with the terrible events. The courage of members of the public and many members of the rescue services who did their best to help in appalling circumstances. The response of Manchester as it came together after the attack to support all those who've been affected. And the efforts of the bereaved families and survivors to try and make something good come out of tragedy in their varied and different ways. I am especially grateful to the bereaved families for their continuous support throughout the inquiry. It is impossible to imagine how difficult it must have been for them to listen to some of the evidence that we have heard. I have not been able to answer all of the questions that they wanted answered, and I'm aware that in my open report on Volume 3, I have raised more questions in their mind. I am sorry, but that was inevitable. I did ask the questions. I did get answers. But for the reasons I have given, I have not been able to report publicly what those answers were. It has been an enormous responsibility, as well as a privilege, to conduct this inquiry. I can only hope that we achieve something by our efforts. That will only happen if those away from this inquiry can share in the desires of those who have taken part in it to make things better. Inevitably, some of the changes that are needed will require money, which is in short supply. But protecting the lives of the people of this country must be a high priority for any government. Thank you.
Of the third and final part of Sir John Saunders' report into the Manchester Arena bombing, and this is a pretty damning assessment of MI5 and its part. A significant missed opportunity, said Sir John, by MI5 to act over a key piece of intelligence that might have prevented the Manchester Arena bombing. That's what the inquiry has found. In details, he said that the public report not revealing what that intelligence was, because MI5 evidence the inquiry heard in secret because of reasons for national security. However, finding that that first piece of intelligence should have been shared with counter-terrorism police, and that an MI5 officer should have written a report on the second piece of intelligence on the day they assessed it, but failed to do so. The MI5 officer, we're told at the time, bearing in mind the possibility of the information related to activity of pressing national security concern. So Sir John indicating that there are a number of closed recommendations being made because of obviously the sensitive nature of the intelligence, and that those recommendations will be monitored by the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. It is a very difficult conclusion for the families to take on board. Let's speak to Sophie Reaper, our reporter outside the Magistrates' Court there in Manchester, where Sir John has just been revealing those issues. And Sophie, the additional part of this, that MI5 perhaps had an indication that Salman Abedi and his brother had been in Libya, perhaps part of the radicalisation going on there, meeting violent extremists. Very difficult things for the families to take on board.
Well, we always knew this was going to be a very difficult day for all of those families and the survivors of that attack. We just heard Sir John speaking there, and he broke down this volume into 3 sections. The first part being the radicalisation of Salman Abedi. He talked about the family holding significant responsibility for the radicalisation of Salman and his brother Hashim. They also talked about the Libyan conflict having an influence, and Sir John said that he was as satisfied as he can be that an instructive video from Islamic extremists showed the brothers how they could carry out the attack. He then moved into the planning and preparation stage of their attack, and he said a key thing is that the purchase of the chemicals they used for the bomb should have been reported to authorities, because if they had, the attack could have been prevented. Of course, he then moved on to the final stage, prevention. You mentioned there that there's no certainty to this, but if they had reported that key intelligence, the attack could have been prevented that way. He said, based on everything the security service knew or should have known, I am satisfied that such an investigative action would have been a proportionate and justified step to take. This should have happened. Although I accept that Salman Abedi demonstrated some security consciousness and that this may have affected the efficacy of the investigative action that I have identified, there was real possibility that it would have produced actionable intelligence. Now, he did say that no one should underestimate the work that's done by our security services. He said that, of course, no one there was trying to assist Salman Abedi and that they work hard to prevent terrorists carrying out attacks. However, he did say that if mistakes are made, they need to be identified and steps need to be taken to put them right. Of course, this is the 3rd and final volume of the Manchester Arena inquiry, so that he then finished talking in his conclusion by thanking the various people involved, witnesses and people from the various bodies who made failures, who have spoken to him as part of his inquiries. He thanks the families, who he obviously acknowledged it's such a difficult time for them. He said he was grateful for everyone's assistance. It was an appalling loss that was so unnecessary. But I think the key thing that we take away that he said, it was a really poignant line at the end, he wants something good to come out of this tragedy. And I think that's something that really resonates not only with the families and the survivors, not only the people of Manchester City, who has really taken the victims of this attack to their hearts, but across the world. This has been such a huge story over the past almost 6 years now. And although the inquiry is now, we've heard everything that there is to hear from it, it's certainly not over. As we said there, Sir John hasn't been able to give all of the answers, and it's something that the victims and survivors will have to live with for the rest of their lives.
Indeed, but the recommendations, as we just heard, going to be monitored by Parliament in terms of learning lessons. As you said, what an appalling loss that was so unnecessary. Sophie, at Manchester, thank you very much. Of course, reaction from the families as we get it. But let's get an update on all the other headlines now with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mark. It's 2:34, your top stories from the GB newsroom. As we've been hearing, an inquiry into the Manchester Arena terror attack has found MI5 missed opportunities to prevent the bombing. The report found the security service failed to act on significant intelligence received in the months before the 2017 attack. The information relating to suicide bomber Salman Abedi was assessed at the time as not terror-related. However, it could have led to his stored explosives. It also found Abedi could have been arrested at Manchester Airport 4 days before he went on to kill 22 people at the Ariana Grande concert.
I have found a significant missed opportunity to take action that might have prevented the attack. There was a realistic possibility that actionable intelligence could have been obtained which might have led to actions preventing the attack. The reasons for this missed opportunity included a failure by the security service, in my view, to act swiftly enough.
Sir John Saunders, the chairman of that inquiry, speaking there. Boris Johnson has expressed concerns over Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. Speaking in Westminster earlier, the former Prime Minister said he'd find it very difficult to vote for the Windsor deal, saying it wasn't about the UK taking back control. The deal with the EU aims to fix post-Brexit trade problems in Northern Ireland. Police are continuing their search in the area where the remains of a baby were found in Brighton last night. Officers say the body was close to where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon were arrested on Monday. The couple had evaded authorities for more than 7 weeks, but refused to give any information on the location or welfare of their baby. They're currently being held on suspicion of child neglect manslaughter. The police are due to make a statement shortly, and we'll cross live to that as soon as we get it. And Matt Hancock says he's a victim of a massive betrayal after more than 100,000 of his WhatsApp messages were leaked. The former Health Secretary handed over his texts to journalist Isabel Oakeshott as they collaborated on his memoirs. She then passed them on to The Telegraph. The paper claims Mr Hancock clashed with then Education Secretary Sir Gavin Williamson over schools during COVID. Hancock reportedly said he was mounting rearguard action to close schools in December 2020. That's despite Sir Gavin fighting tooth and nail to keep them open. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. Just to update you, we are expecting another news conference from Sussex Police down in Brighton with a post-mortem, of course, continuing on the remains of that baby discovered in that inquiry. We'll go to Brighton when that happens, but let's now reflect on that fallout from the so-called lockdown files, these WhatsApp messages. Teaching unions now have criticised what they call the contemptible comments by the then Education Secretary, Sir Gavin Williamson, who appear to accuse staff of looking for an excuse not to work during the COVID pandemic. Those comments in the latest set of leaked messages published by the Daily Telegraph. Now, on October the 1st, 2020, Matt Hancock had sent a message to Sir Gavin to congratulate him, on the decision to delay A-level exams for a few weeks. Sir Gavin responded by saying, of the unions, that is, I know they are really, or just really do just hate to work. Well, Sir Gavin has this morning defended those comments on Twitter by saying he'd not been criticising teachers, but, quote, some unions. Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary, saying the messages leaked by The Telegraph and journalist Isabel Oakeshott were a betrayal and a breach of trust. Isabel Oakeshott saying she makes no apology that this is in the national interest. Well, let's get the views now of journalist and political commentator Joanne Nadler, who joins us. And Joanne, of course, we are expecting more in The Telegraph in the days ahead. And Isabel Oakeshott doubling down on this point she's making. It is in the public interest. And certainly for those directly affected by COVID, it shows a government trying to wrestle with all the problems.
Yes, to a certain extent, of course, that is what it shows. But it also shows a government that was very preoccupied with its public image, that was making policy up on the hoof, and that was recoursing to expressions like the science long before there was really any settled view, and nor could there be, frankly, on a number of the critical issues that would have led it to make the decisions that it did, that had such a fundamental effect on all our lives. So,
Joanne, I do apologise. I'm just going to interrupt you because we're just, I think, going to hear from the police down in Brighton. Stay with us there. Let's head down to Brighton News Conference.
Lieutenant Lewis Basford from the Metropolitan Police, and I'm here to provide you a brief update on our ongoing investigation. My team have been working on this investigation for the past 8 weeks, and we have travelled across the country as part of our searches for this baby. We are truly devastated by the outcome, and we know this emotion is being felt here in Brighton and across the country today. We know there are still many unanswered questions, and it is important that we give the investigation team the time and space they need to establish more details about the circumstances of this tragic death. At this stage, we have not yet been able to confirm the baby's gender, and a post-mortem examination has not yet taken place. Despite this, based on our inquiries we've carried out so far, we believe, sadly, the baby may have been dead for some time before they were found. It's too early for us to provide a more specific date. Because we believe the death occurred during the course of a missing person investigation, we have made a mandatory referral to the Independent Office of Police Conduct. This is a standard protocol for such circumstances. I can also confirm that Constance Martin and Mark Gordon remain in custody at this time, and the warrant for further detention that was granted yesterday will take us through to late evening. Officers from the Met will remain in this area for the coming days, and I'll now hand over to my colleague, Chief Superintendent James Collis from Sussex Police.
Good afternoon. We have seen an outpouring of public sorrow following yesterday's heartbreaking discovery, and have been overwhelmed by kind messages and support to those involved in this challenging search and investigation. The latest developments mean that the investigation is moving into a new phase, and while the Metropolitan Police will remain in the area, the large police presence for the search will be scaled back. Our neighbourhood officers will continue to be in the local community to offer support and address any concerns. I would once again like to thank the public for their patience and support through this operation, and express my gratitude to the huge number of people who have helped or offered to help in any way that they can. It is truly appreciated. We will continue to support the Metropolitan Police's inquiries and ask that the investigation is given space to proceed as we establish the full facts of what has happened. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Can you confirm the baby you found is that of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon?
On the inquiry there from Detective Superintendent Lewis Bassett from Metropolitan Police, and also James Collis there from Sussex Police. The post-mortem has clearly taken place. Sadly, they say the baby may have been dead for some time. The infant's remains found in that woodland to the north of Hollingbury in Brighton, and Detective Superintendent Bassett indicating, because obviously of the time element, that the whole investigation now being referred to the Independent Office for Police in terms of the delay, as some would say, before the couple was actually traced, and then, of course, the body of the baby being found. In terms of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, they are still being held on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter until this evening, the 36 hours granted by the magistrates, and, of course, then the legal process will continue. James Collis thanking the local community for their help, and as we were saying a little earlier, flowers, candles and other things being taken by the local population there to that area of the allotments at the centre of the search. Very, very difficult for both, of course, the police service and the local neighbourhood there after the circumstances of these last 24 hours. We'll update you as we get more on that, but let's return now to this issue of the lockdown files as they've been described. We were speaking to Joanne Adler for her reaction. Joanne, as we say, apologies for breaking away to get that update, but we're obviously trying to make sense of what this is telling us about how the government handled it, and whether indeed, as Isabel Oakeshott has asserted, this is still in the public interest.
Oh, I mean, I think it's very, very definitely in the public interest, if for no other reason that it's extremely important that we're all vigilant constantly about how government works and how the state works. And already this afternoon, we've had that extremely distressing story that you were reporting on earlier about the inquiry into the Manchester bombing. And yet again, we've seen failures of the state. So to the extent that there was not only a lockdown of all of our behaviours and our normal freedoms during the period of the epidemic, there was also, in a sense, a lockdown in scrutiny And the vast majority of the media didn't really ask any questions about exactly how much of this lockdown was necessary, what was driving it, whether there was perhaps a different way to view the epidemic. We've heard only this week that the FBI is now conceding that quite possibly the lab leak theory about the origins of the epidemic is a legitimate one. And we only have to think back 2 years to the extent that there was just a complete orthodoxy on what could and couldn't be discussed. So for that reason alone, I think it's absolutely important that this information is in the public realm.
Is it really, however, about the lockdown, or is it really about what the government was trying to do to keep us all safe? I mean, the point has been made about Isabel Oakeshott that she is a lockdown sceptic.
I hardly think that's relevant in the sense that whatever her motivation was in making this information public, the fact is that it is now in the public domain. And as I said,
let me just interrupt. I mean, in terms of Matt Hancock, it is pretty relevant because he's made that point on several occasions now.
Well, I mean, Matt Hancock is maintaining, as I understand it, that he has made this information available to the public inquiry. But the public inquiry, we don't know when it's going to report. Yeah. We don't quite know what its terms of investigation are going to be. And I'm just very much hoping that these revelations, albeit, of course, we have to accept that they will also be partially reported to a certain extent. But what it may do, what I'm hoping it will do, is help to frame some of the terms of that inquiry so that we're not just facing something which will ask, why didn't the government lock down further and faster? Or that we'll have an inquiry that actually investigates why we perhaps didn't go down the Swedish model. And I think, any pressure to take a broader approach to this inquiry is just wholly for the public good.
Yeah, OK, and also address the fact that, of course, 17,678 people died in the care homes before the lockdown was actually in place. But clearly we'll see what comes in the future editions of The Telegraph, as you say, the lockdown files. But, Joanne, thank you for that. Apologies, as we say, for breaking away to get that breaking news. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Harry and Meghan confirming they've been asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage after the reports in the various newspapers. Suggestions Prince Andrew may be offering or being offered the keys instead, and their belongings being shipped from that 10-bedroom royal residence to California, where they currently live with their 2 children. Our royal reporter Cameron Morker is with us. So, Frog March from Frogmore, as some of the headlines might suggest.
Yes, confirmed last night to me by a spokesperson for the couple from California. They are being asked to leave Frogmore Cottage. It's been their official residence in the United Kingdom since 2018. Following their wedding, £2.4 million of taxpayers' money was spent doing it up. When they stepped back as working members of the royal family, they repaid that money.
Right.
Now, the Crown Estate owns the property, and it's their decision to ask Harry and Meghan to leave. However, the King, according to reports, signed off on it the day after Prince Harry's memoir Spare was released. And his memoir detailed allegations of the Queen Consort planting stories within or leaking stories to the UK media to increase make a better profile for herself, which clearly has not been confirmed by Buckingham Palace. They are making no comment on that. However, we were always led to believe that Camilla would be Charles's red line, and the timing of this suggests that is the case.
Yeah, and the timing of this particular announcement before the, as we understand, official coronation sort of list is actually assessed, because the big question was, would Harry and Meghan be invited? Would they come over? Are we getting an indication now that the ties are being cut?
Yes, we are led to believe that Harry and Meghan are going to have to vacate the property around the time of the coronation. Whether it's before or after, we'll have to wait and see. I know for a fact coronation invitations have not gone out yet. Official invitations will not go out until probably a few weeks before the event itself. However, there will be save the dates coming in the next couple of weeks.
Shall we indulge in another session of Royal Monopoly in terms of the various... Because we've got, just to sort of backtrack, we've got Royal Lodge now where Prince Andrew is. Suggestions that maybe King Charles would like Andrew to move to Frogmore, making therefore Royal Lodge available maybe for the Prince and Princess of Wales, who are in another cottage on the Windsor estate at the moment.
Yes, it's all very confusing, isn't it? It's basically, think of it as a massive perimeter guarded by the Metropolitan Police.
Which is important in itself because of the security situation.
It is, yeah, in Windsor, very close to the castle. The Prince and Princess of Wales live in Adelaide Cottage. Prince Andrew currently lives in the massive 30-bedroom or so mansion Royal Lodge. He has, at the moment, around 250 grand allowance from the King, and it was the Queen, but we're led to believe that that allowance is being cut, which means that he can't afford the upkeep of Royal Lodge.
Because the upkeep is being paid from that money rather than from the taxpayer.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
an important thing to point out. Yeah,
it's being paid from the funds from the King rather than the taxpayer, because the Prince Andrew no longer is a working member of the royal family, and therefore he's not entitled to any taxpayer-funded anything, really.
Yeah.
But you're right. So the plan, according to reports, is for Prince Andrew to move into Frogmore Cottage because Harry and Meghan are not in the UK often enough to warrant having
and he would
property.
still have to pay a rent for that. The taxpayer would not be funding that.
He would have to pay rent. Harry and Meghan pay a rent on Frogmore Cottage, we're led to believe. So no taxpayer-funded money is going to go into this. Prince and Princess of Wales, different story. They, of course, are heirs to the throne. Prince William is heirs to the throne. They are working royals. They do have taxpayer-funded security.
Now, you made a very interesting point, a reflection, that clearly their children are at school. They have their school friends back. And the comment has been that perhaps some of their school friends have rather grander properties than that. As Adelaide Cottage, isn't there? They're in it.
Yes, according to the Daily Mail, that is the case. All three children go to Lambrook School, which is it's an independent school, so clearly it's fee-paying. So a number of their peers, according to the Mail, live in properties which are perhaps slightly more grand than Adelaide Cottage, where Will and Kate live with their 3 kids. It's a 4-bedroom property. There's not even room for the nanny, Mark, because there's only 4 bedrooms. So some people are suggesting that perhaps they would move into Royal Lodge. That has not been confirmed by Kensington Palace by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. OK.
But that is what's being reported.
But they've still got their property on the Sandringham estate as well, which I think the Queen gifted to them.
Yes, so they were gifted Anne Hall, William and Catherine, following their wedding in 2011. That is their country retreat on the Sandringham estate. They also still have their apartment 1A at Kensington Palace, and that is where their staff is based, the communications teams, the private secretaries and so on. So they do still use that. However, they live their personal lives in Adelaide Cottage on the Windsor estate.
Right, OK. Well done. I think we got there past £200 and yeah.
I hope you stay with me.
Yeah,
a lot of properties.
I think someone needs to actually perhaps produce a Royal Monopoly edition, but we shall see.
That would be good.
Thank you very much indeed for taking us all through that. Now, let's remind you, would you believe 54 years today, Concorde, that iconic supersonic jet, took to the skies for its maiden flight, cruising at a maximum speed of 1,300 miles per hour, crossing the Atlantic within 3.5 hours with a big bang. The Anglo-French aircraft, a symbol of national pride, but in 2003, you remember, taken out of service after the problems and the aftermath, indeed, of its crash, touching down for a final time at an airfield in Bristol. We're joining us now to look back on Rise and Fall. Di Whittingham, former RAF pilot and chief executive of the UK Flight Safety Committee. And Di, I have to share to you, I was lucky enough to fly on it, not across the Atlantic, but when they took school children on the 50th anniversary of Heathrow with the chief pilot who took them supersonic within 12 minutes of leaving UK airspace with full afterburners on. It was quite some experience flying it.
I'm sure it was. And I, as a boy, remember watching that first flight on the television, black and white, of course. But what a fantastic technological achievement it was. And interestingly, the early development work on that, it goes back to the 50s, and 2 German aerodynamicists and mathematicians who'd come over with a number of scientists after the war. And one of them, a lady called Johanna Weber. So women involved in technology at that stage in aviation, you could be forgiven for thinking that there were no women involved. It would be very wrong, in much the same way as the Saturn Apollo program. Again, a lot of the maths was done by a lady in the States.
Absolutely, and we're seeing sort of pictures of other supersonic aircraft now that may follow in its trail. But of course, it was just fantastic in terms of the technology available at the time. Have we actually perhaps apportioned it rather to a great UK symbol when in fact the French, of course, worked alongside us?
The French did. A little bit of political skullduggery saw the work from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough was leaked to Sud Aviation, and funnily enough, they came up with a remarkably similar design. So that the collaboration was always on the cards. Bearing in mind, this was at the time when the UK was busy trying to join the European Economic Community at that stage. And so yes, a collaborative program, only 20 built, because as it was entering service, it coincided with the big oil crisis of 1973, lots of scares about how much fuel it was going to use, and of course the problem with noise. And I think today it just would not have been possible. No. So what you saw there on the Boom project is a technology program that's looking to try and reduce the impact of the sonic booms, which is one of the big problems, which allow you to go supersonic over land. The aim being the noise of a door closing, car door closing.
We'll have to close the door on that, I'm afraid, Di. We've run out of time, but thank you very much indeed, paying tribute, of course, to a wonderful plane, an icon. That's it from us for now. Just to say thank you to another member of the team leaving us, Ryan. It's been great to have you on board as well. It's been great for you to be on board with us as well here on GB News Live. And tomorrow, it's Andrew back with you. Patrick's next.
Afternoon, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Most will have a dry day again tomorrow. Brighter day across much of the north, whereas in the south, after quite a bit of sunshine today, it will be cloudier. We've got this large area of high pressure continuing to dominate our weather. As I said, keeping most places dry, but with the breeze coming in from the east, we have seen a few showers coming into parts of southern Scotland, and the chance of 1 or 2 still through the central belt and across southern Scotland into the evening. But they should be fading, I think, generally overnight. The odd one for the east of Northern Ireland as well. But most places dry. Clearer skies in West Wales, southwest England, and across much of northern Scotland will allow a frost. Most towns and cities, and where it's cloudy, will stay above freezing. But nevertheless, quite a chilly feel on Friday morning with a rather drab start for sure. Bit of a breeze blowing across Kent and the breeze picking up across the Northern Isles, where there may be a few showers from late morning onwards. The cloud thick enough over the Midlands and eastern England, maybe for the odd light shower, but generally it'll be dry. Some sunny spells developing here, and generally a sunny day across much of central and northern Scotland too. Temperatures around or even a touch below average. In the sunshine it won't feel too bad at all, but where it's grey, again quite a cold feel, particularly with the breeze on some of these eastern coasts. I think as we go through Friday evening, we'll see the cloud breaking up a little bit more, so we'll see a few more places getting down to freezing as we head into the weekend. So Saturday morning, starting with a frost, certainly across a good part of Scotland, northern England. Generally, again, a lot of cloud across the south, but we should see some sunny spells over western parts of Scotland, northwest England, and down to the southwest as well. But overall, cloudy and a few more showers coming in, perhaps to the east of England, certainly across northeast Scotland during Saturday. But apart from that, most of the weekend looking dry, but it is going to turn colder, especially next week when there is the possibility of some snow.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. It's 3 p.m, it's Patrick Christie's on GB News. Now, teaching unions are lazy backsides of human beings who hate work. Not my words, not my words. The words of Matt Hancock